Story 1. Marcus Chen had been photographing wilderness landscapes for National Geographic for over 8 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter in the uncharted depths of West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest. It was October 2019 when he received a tip from a local ranger about a hidden valley that supposedly contained some of the most pristine fall foliage in the entire Appalachian region. The ranger, an old-timer named Bill Hutchinson, had given Marcus rough coordinates to a trailhead that wasn't on any official map. "Most folks don't know about this place," Bill had said, his weathered face serious. "Been keeping it quiet for good reason. Beautiful country, but, well, you just be careful up there, son. Stick to the main path and don't go chasing after sounds you might hear." Marcus had laughed off the warning at the time. After years of solo photography expeditions in remote locations across North America, he considered himself well prepared for whatever the wilderness could throw at him. He packed his usual gear, professional camera equipment, camping supplies for 3 days, GPS device, satellite communicator, and enough food and water to last a week if necessary. The trailhead was exactly where Bill had indicated, marked only by a faded wooden post with no signage. Marcus parked his rental Jeep and checked his GPS one final time before heading into the forest. The device showed his location clearly, but beyond this point, the screen displayed nothing but blank green space. No trails, no landmarks, no emergency services markers. He was truly going off the grid. The first day of hiking was spectacular. The forest was dense with ancient oaks, maples, and birches, their leaves painted in brilliant shades of gold, crimson, and orange. Marcus spent hours capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the way morning mist clung to the valleys, and the pristine streams that wound through moss-covered rocks. By evening, he had set up camp in a small clearing beside a babbling creek, feeling accomplished and at peace. It was around midnight when he first heard the voices. Marcus woke to the sound of what seemed like a conversation happening just beyond his tent. 2 people, maybe 3, speaking in hushed tones about 50 yards away. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was distinctly human, the rise and fall of questions and answers, occasional laughter, the comfortable rhythm of friends chatting around a campfire. Confused but not particularly alarmed, Marcus unzipped his tent flap and peered into the darkness. His campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting barely enough light to illuminate his immediate surroundings. He called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" His voice echoed strangely in the dense forest, seeming to bounce off unseen walls of trees and rock. The voices stopped immediately. Marcus waited for several minutes, straining his ears in the sudden silence. When no response came, he chalked it up to his imagination or perhaps the strange acoustics of the valley. He had been hiking alone for so long that his mind might be playing tricks on him, creating phantom conversations from the sounds of wind through leaves and water over stones. The second day brought more incredible photography opportunities, and Marcus pushed deeper into the valley, following what appeared to be an old game trail. The forest grew denser and more primordial with each mile. Ancient trees towered overhead, their canopy so thick that even midday sunlight filtered down in ethereal beams. He felt like he was walking through a cathedral built by nature itself. It was late afternoon when he heard his name being called. "Marcus! Marcus! Over here!" The voice was clear, definitely human, and seemed to come from somewhere off to his right. It sounded like his college roommate Danny, whom he hadn't seen in over 5 years. Marcus stopped dead in his tracks, his blood running cold. There was no way Danny could be here in the middle of nowhere calling his name. "Danny?" Marcus called back hesitantly. "Is that you? Marcus, come find me, man. I'm lost." The voice definitely sounded like Danny, the same slight Boston accent, the same inflection patterns. But something felt wrong. The tone was too even, too controlled, lacking the genuine panic that someone who was actually lost would display. Marcus pulled out his satellite communicator and checked for a signal. Nothing. The device showed no connection to any satellites, which should have been impossible with the clear sky above. His GPS was also malfunctioning, displaying error messages and spinning wildly between coordinates. "Danny, where are you exactly?" Marcus shouted back, his photographer's instincts telling him to document everything. He pulled out his camera and began recording video. "I'm hurt, Marcus. I need help. Please come find me." Now the voice sounded different, more desperate, more plaintive, but it still carried Danny's distinctive vocal patterns. Marcus felt his skin crawl as he realized what was bothering him. The voice was too perfect. It was exactly how Danny sounded, but without any of the small variations and imperfections that make human speech natural and believable. Against his better judgment, Marcus began moving toward the source of the voice, camera in hand. The undergrowth grew thicker, forcing him to push through tangles of thorny vines and low-hanging branches. The game trail he had been following disappeared entirely. "Keep calling, Danny. I'm coming to find you." "Over here, Marcus. Hurry. I think I broke my leg." The voice was leading him deeper into a part of the forest where the trees grew so close together that their trunks formed natural walls. Marcus began to feel claustrophobic, as if the forest itself were closing in around him. The air grew heavy and still, carrying strange odors, not the clean scent of decomposing leaves and fresh earth, but something more animal, more primitive. Then he heard another voice calling his name. This one sounded exactly like his sister, Rebecca. "Marcus, thank God I've been looking everywhere for you." Marcus stopped moving entirely. Rebecca lived in Seattle and hadn't spoken to him in months after a family argument. There was absolutely no conceivable way she could be here. Yet the voice was perfect. Her slight vocal fry, her habit of emphasizing the first syllable of his name. "Rebecca," he called out weakly. "I'm so scared, Marcus. Please help me." Now there were multiple voices, all calling his name. Danny's voice from the right, Rebecca's from ahead, and what sounded like his high school girlfriend Sarah calling from somewhere behind him. Each voice was perfectly accurate, capturing not just the sound but the speech patterns and emotional inflections of people he had known throughout his life. Marcus began backing away, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He raised his camera and started recording everything, panning across the dense forest as the voices continued their chorus of familiar pleas. That's when he saw movement in the shadows between the trees. At first it looked like a person crouched behind a massive oak trunk about 30 yards away. The figure was completely still, watching him. Marcus zoomed in with his camera lens, trying to get a clearer view. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. The figure had the general shape of a human, but something was fundamentally wrong with its proportions. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. It was completely naked and covered in what looked like dirt and matted hair. But most disturbing of all, its mouth was open in an impossibly wide grin, showing far too many teeth. "Marcus," it called in Danny's voice, though its mouth didn't move in sync with the words. "Why won't you come help me?" Marcus turned and ran. He crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes and equipment, his camera bag bouncing painfully against his back. Behind him, the voices multiplied. Now he could hear his mother calling, his father, his ex-wife, college professors, childhood friends, a grotesque chorus of every important voice from his past, all begging him to come back, to help them, to not leave them alone in the dark forest. The voices followed him as he ran, seeming to come from all directions at once. Sometimes they were close enough that he could feel breath on the back of his neck. Other times they echoed from far ahead, as if the creatures were somehow circling around to get in front of him. Marcus ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He collapsed beside a fallen log, gasping for air and trying to get his bearings. The voices had stopped, leaving him in an oppressive silence that was somehow even more terrifying than the phantom calls had been. He checked his equipment. His camera was still recording, though the battery was nearly dead. His GPS remained useless, showing only error codes. The satellite communicator was completely dead, its screen black and unresponsive. As darkness fell, Marcus made the decision to abandon his planned campsite and try to find his way back to the trailhead immediately. Using his camera's LCD screen as a makeshift flashlight, he began retracing his steps as best he could remember. It took him all night, stumbling through the darkness while fighting off panic attacks every time he heard what might be a twig snapping or leaves rustling in the distance. Several times he thought he heard familiar voices calling softly from the woods around him, but he forced himself to keep moving and ignore them. Marcus finally reached his jeep just as dawn was breaking. He threw his equipment in the back and drove away without looking back, not stopping until he reached the ranger station where he had met Bill Hutchinson. Bill took one look at Marcus's haggard appearance and shook his head knowingly. "You heard 'em, didn't you, the Hollow folks?" "What are they?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and fear. "Nobody knows for sure," Bill replied grimly. "Been stories about them for generations. People who went into those deep woods and never came back out the same. Some say they're folks who got lost up there years ago and went feral. Others think they're something else entirely. All I know is they can mimic any voice they've ever heard, and they use that gift to lure people deeper into places where nobody will ever find them." Marcus reviewed his camera footage later, back in the safety of his hotel room. Most of it was too dark or shaky to make out clearly, but there were several frames that showed humanoid figures moving through the trees, always at the edge of the image, always just unclear enough to leave doubt about what they really were. He never published those photographs, and he never returned to West Virginia. But sometimes late at night in his apartment in Denver, Marcus still hears familiar voices calling his name from places where no one should be able to speak. Story 2. Doctor. Sarah Martinez had spent 15 years exploring cave systems across the United States, but her discovery in the limestone karst region of south-central Kentucky would challenge everything she thought she knew about human habitation in underground environments. As a professional speleologist with the National Speleological Society, Sarah had mapped over 200 cave systems, but the unnamed cavern she found in March 2020 was unlike anything in the geological literature. The cave entrance was discovered almost by accident during a routine survey of the area surrounding Mammoth Cave National Park. Sarah was part of a 3-person team documenting unmapped limestone formations when heavy spring rains washed away decades of accumulated debris, revealing a narrow opening in a cliff face that had been completely hidden from view. Her colleagues, Dr. Jim Hendricks and graduate student Mark Torres, had returned to base camp to upload their preliminary findings, leaving Sarah to conduct an initial solo reconnaissance. The entrance was barely wide enough for a single person, requiring Sarah to remove her pack and push it ahead of her as she squeezed through the opening. Beyond the constricted entrance, the passage opened into a natural corridor about 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, carved by countless centuries of underground water flow. The walls were smooth limestone, polished to an almost marble-like finish by the patient work of geological time. Sarah's headlamp illuminated formations that took her breath away. Flowstone cascades hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and delicate soda straw stalactites created natural chandeliers in the darkness. The air was cool and humid, carrying the distinctive earthy smell of deep caves mixed with something else she couldn't immediately identify, a musky, organic odor that seemed out of place in the sterile underground environment. Following standard speleological protocol, Sarah began mapping the cave system as she progressed deeper into the mountain. She placed survey markers every 50 feet and carefully documented the dimensions and notable features of each chamber. The main passage continued for nearly 300 yards before opening into a massive room that her headlamp couldn't fully illuminate. The cathedral chamber, as she mentally dubbed it, was roughly circular and at least 60 feet in diameter. Enormous flowstone columns connected floor to ceiling like the pillars of some ancient temple. Sarah estimated the ceiling height at over 40 feet, disappearing into shadows beyond her light's reach. The acoustic properties were remarkable. Every footstep, every breath, every small sound echoed with perfect clarity. It was while documenting this chamber that Sarah first noticed the footprints. They were pressed into a patch of soft clay near a small underground stream that trickled along one wall of the chamber. At first glance, they appeared to be barefoot human prints, but something about their size and shape disturbed her. They were too wide, with toes that seemed abnormally long and spread far apart. The heel impressions were deep and narrow, suggesting a gait that was more crouched than upright. Sarah knelt beside the clearest print and held her own booted foot next to it for comparison. Even accounting for her size 8 hiking boots, the mysterious footprint was significantly larger and anatomically different. She photographed the prints from multiple angles, including scale references, and collected a small sample of the clay for later analysis. Following the stream deeper into the cave system, Sarah discovered that the footprints weren't isolated. They appeared regularly along the muddy banks, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups of 3 or 4 different sizes. The pattern suggested a family group, adults and children, that had been using this cave system regularly over an extended period. The main passage branched into multiple smaller tunnels, each leading deeper into the mountain. Sarah chose the largest branch, marking her route carefully with survey tape. The tunnel gradually descended, and she could hear the sound of running water growing louder ahead. After another 100 yards, the passage opened into a second large chamber, dominated by an underground lake, fed by a waterfall cascading from an opening high in the ceiling. The sight was magnificent, but what captured Sarah's attention were the obvious signs of long-term human habitation scattered around the chamber's perimeter. Crude shelters had been constructed from flat limestone slabs, creating windbreaks and private sleeping areas. The remains of numerous small fires were evident, carefully contained rings of stones with piles of ash and charcoal that looked relatively fresh. Animal bones were scattered around the fire sites, most of them cracked open to access the marrow within. Sarah recognized deer, rabbit, and what appeared to be cave fish bones among the debris. More disturbing were the personal items she found. Tattered pieces of clothing, so old and worn they were barely recognizable as fabric. A child's sneaker, the brand label completely worn away, but the size suggesting it had belonged to someone very young. Crude tools fashioned from bone and stone, including what appeared to be hunting implements designed to catch cave fish and small mammals. Sarah's excitement at the anthropological implications was tempered by a growing sense of unease. These weren't artifacts from some historical period. Many of the items showed signs of recent use. The fire rings contained ash that was powdery and light grey, indicating they had been used within the past few weeks or months. Some of the animal bones still had scraps of dried meat clinging to them. The realization that she might not be alone in the cave system hit her with sudden, paralyzing force. Sarah turned off her headlamp and stood in absolute darkness, listening intently for any sound that might indicate the presence of other people. The cave was silent, except for the constant dripping of water and the whisper of air movement through the passages. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she began to notice something that made her blood run cold. There was light coming from somewhere deeper in the cave system. Not electric light, but the warm, flickering glow of fire reflecting off limestone walls in one of the distant passages. Sarah waited in the darkness for nearly 10 minutes, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told her to leave immediately and return with proper backup and safety equipment. But her scientific curiosity and the potential significance of finding people living in such isolation compelled her to investigate further. She turned her headlamp back on, keeping it dimmed to the lowest setting, and began moving carefully toward the source of the firelight. The passage she followed was smaller than the main corridors, requiring her to duck in several places where the ceiling dropped to barely 5 feet. The walls showed evidence of regular human passage, smooth wear patterns where hands and shoulders had rubbed against the limestone over countless trips. The passage ended at an overlook above another large chamber. Sarah crouched at the edge and peered down into what could only be described as an underground village. Below her, a community of at least 15 people had created a permanent settlement in the depths of the cave. They lived in elaborate shelters, built from stacked stone and salvaged materials, with multiple fire pits providing light and warmth. The people themselves were like nothing Sarah had ever seen or imagined. They were clearly human, but their appearance had been radically altered by generations of cave living. Their skin was pale to the point of translucency, with a grayish pallor that seemed to glow faintly in the firelight. Their eyes were enormous and completely black, adapted for life in near-total darkness. Hair grew long and unkempt, bleached white by the absence of sunlight. Most disturbing of all was their movement. They didn't walk upright like surface humans, but moved in a low crouch, using their hands for balance and support. Their limbs appeared elongated and thin, giving them an insectile quality that made Sarah's skin crawl. She watched, fascinated and horrified, as they went about what seemed to be evening routines. Some tended fires, others worked on tools or prepared food. Children played games that involved crawling through small spaces with an agility that seemed impossible for normal human anatomy. They communicated in whispers and clicking sounds that carried clearly in the acoustic environment of the cave. Sarah was so absorbed in observing this impossible community that she didn't notice when one of the cave dwellers left the main group and began climbing the passage toward her hiding spot. A hand touched her shoulder. Sarah spun around to find herself face to face with one of the creatures. Up close, its appearance was even more disturbing than she had imagined. The skin was not just pale, but seemed almost transparent, showing the dark network of veins underneath. The eyes were solid black pools that reflected her headlamp like mirrors. When it opened its mouth to speak, she could see that its teeth had been filed or worn into sharp points. "Surface dweller," it said in a voice like rustling leaves. "You should not be here." Sarah tried to back away but found herself at the edge of the overlook with nowhere to go. The creature moved closer, its elongated fingers reaching toward her face, with movements that were fluid and predatory. "Please," Sarah whispered. "I'm just a scientist. I was exploring the cave. I'll leave right now and never tell anyone about this place." The creature tilted its head, studying her with those impossible black eyes. "You have seen too much. The deep places are not for surface dwellers. You bring light where there should be darkness. You bring noise where there should be silence." Other cave dwellers were beginning to climb toward them, moving with the same impossible grace and silence. Sarah realized that her only chance was to run, but she was already surrounded by passages she didn't know, in a cave system she had only partially mapped. "I have food," she said desperately, remembering the energy bars and dried fruit in her pack. "I can trade food for safe passage out of here." The creature's expression didn't change, but it held out one elongated hand. Sarah fumbled in her pack and produced several energy bars, placing them in the creature's palm. The fingers closed around the offerings with surprising gentleness. "Food from the bright world," the creature said, examining the packaging with curiosity. "We remember these things, from before the deep calling." "Before what?" "Before we chose the darkness over the painful light. Before we learned the true ways of the deep earth. Before we became what we were meant to be." The other cave dwellers had reached the overlook now, surrounding Sarah with their pale, watching forms. But they didn't seem immediately threatening. Instead, they appeared curious about her and the items in her pack. "You study the stone bones," the creature said, pointing to Sarah's geological survey equipment. "You understand the deep places. Perhaps you are not like the others who come seeking to take and destroy." Sarah realized this might be her only chance to survive this encounter. "Yes, I study caves. I respect them. I document them to help protect them from people who would damage them." The creatures exchanged glances and made those strange clicking sounds that seemed to be their primary form of communication. Finally, the first creature spoke again. "We will guide you back to the entrance, but you must promise never to return, and never to speak of what you have seen. The deep places must remain secret from the bright world." Sarah nodded eagerly. "I promise. I'll never tell anyone about this place." The journey back to the entrance took over an hour, with the cave dwellers leading her through passages she had never seen. They moved through the darkness without any light source, navigating by touch and sound with an expertise that spoke of lifetimes spent in the underground world. They brought her to within sight of the narrow entrance before melting back into the shadows as silently as they had appeared. Sarah emerged from the cave as the sun was setting, her mind reeling from what she had experienced. She sat by the entrance for a long time, trying to process what she had seen and decide what to do with the knowledge. In the end, she kept her promise. Sarah's official report documented the cave's geological features and recommended it for protection due to its pristine formations, but made no mention of its human inhabitants. She sealed the entrance with loose rocks and vegetation, making it appear as though the recent rains had naturally filled the opening. But sometimes, late at night in her laboratory, Sarah finds herself wondering about the community she discovered in the depths of the Kentucky limestone. She wonders how long they've been there, how they came to adapt to life in permanent darkness, and whether they are the descendants of people who chose to abandon the surface world or something else entirely. The clay sample she collected tested positive for human DNA, but with genetic markers, unlike anything in the established databases. The photographs of the footprints remain locked in her private files, too extraordinary to publish without the context she can never provide. And on quiet nights when the wind is still, Sarah sometimes thinks she can hear the sound of clicking voices carried on the underground currents of air that flow through the hidden passages beneath Kentucky. Story 3. The Watching Ridge. Story 3. David Kellerman had been hunting the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia for over 20 years, but he had never encountered anything like what happened during his solo deer hunting trip in November 2018. As a 42-year-old machinist from Richmond, David considered himself an experienced outdoorsman who knew how to handle himself in the wilderness. He owned a small hunting cabin on 40 acres of remote mountain property, inherited from his grandfather, where he spent most weekends during hunting season. The cabin sat on a narrow ridge overlooking a deep valley, accessible only by a winding dirt road that became nearly impassable during heavy rains. David loved the isolation. The nearest neighbor was over 5 miles away, and cell phone service was non-existent. It was exactly the kind of place where a man could disconnect from the modern world and reconnect with more primitive instincts. David arrived at the cabin on a Thursday evening in mid-November, planning to spend a long weekend hunting the white-tailed deer that were abundant in the area. The weather was perfect for hunting, cold and clear, with just enough wind to mask human scent, but not enough to make shooting difficult. He spent his first evening cleaning his rifle, checking his trail cameras, and preparing for what he hoped would be a successful hunt. The cabin was rustic but comfortable, with a wood-burning stove for heat, a propane refrigerator, and a small generator for electricity when needed. David preferred to use kerosene lanterns in the evening, finding their warm light more relaxing than harsh electric bulbs. He went to bed early that first night, planning to be in his tree stand before dawn. David woke at 4:30 a.m. and made a quick breakfast of coffee and eggs before gathering his hunting gear. His tree stand was located about half a mile from the cabin, positioned to overlook a natural deer trail that ran along the valley floor. The pre-dawn hike through the forest was familiar and comfortable, guided by the beam of his headlamp along a path he had walked hundreds of times. The morning hunt was productive. David saw several does and a young buck, though nothing large enough to justify taking a shot. He spent 4 hours in the stand, enjoying the peaceful sounds of the forest waking up and the gradual brightening of the sky through the canopy above. By 10 a.m., deer activity had decreased significantly, so he decided to return to the cabin for lunch and an afternoon nap before the evening hunt. It was on the walk back to the cabin that David first noticed he was being watched. The feeling started as a vague uneasiness, the kind of primitive instinct that had kept humans alive for millennia, but was often ignored in modern life. David had learned to trust these feelings during his years of hunting. Something in the forest was paying attention to him, studying his movements, with an intensity that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. David stopped walking and stood perfectly still, scanning the forest around him for any sign of movement. The woods were quiet except for the normal sounds of birds and small animals going about their daily routines. But the feeling of being observed didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, as though whatever was watching him had moved closer during his moment of stillness. He completed the walk to his cabin without incident, but the sensation of invisible eyes following his progress never left him. David checked his perimeter carefully, looking for tracks or other signs that someone or something had been near his property. He found nothing unusual, but his unease persisted throughout the afternoon. That evening, David decided to hunt from a different location, a ground blind he had set up on the opposite side of his property. The blind was constructed from natural materials and positioned to overlook a small meadow where deer often came to feed in the evening hours. David settled into the blind well before sunset, his rifle ready and his senses alert. As darkness began to fall, David heard movement in the forest behind him, not the normal sounds of deer or other wildlife, but something larger and more deliberate. The footsteps were definitely bipedal, with a slow, careful rhythm that suggested someone trying to move quietly through the underbrush. David turned slowly in his blind, trying to identify the source of the sounds without making noise himself. Through a gap in the brush, he caught a glimpse of a human figure moving between the trees about 50 yards away. The figure appeared to be watching the meadow, just as David was, but from a different angle. At first, David assumed he was seeing another hunter who had somehow gained access to his private property. Poaching was not uncommon in the area, and David had encountered trespassers before. He was prepared to confront the intruder when something about the figure's movement made him hesitate. The person moved through the forest with an unnatural silence and fluidity, never seeming to disturb the undergrowth or step on fallen branches that would normally make noise. More disturbing was the way the figure stood, perfectly motionless for long periods, then suddenly shifting position without any transitional movement, like a time-lapse photograph of a shadow moving across the ground. David decided to wait and observe rather than confronting the intruder immediately. Through his rifle scope, he was able to get a better look at the mysterious figure. What he saw made his blood run cold. The person appeared to be wearing David's own clothing, the same camouflage pattern jacket he had worn that morning, the same orange hunting cap, even what looked like the same brown work boots. But something was wrong with the proportions. The clothes hung strangely, as though they were being worn by someone with a fundamentally different body shape. More disturbing still was the figure's behavior. It was mimicking David's own hunting posture and movements, copying the way he held his rifle, the way he scanned the forest, even the way he occasionally shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The imitation was perfect in every detail, like watching himself in a funhouse mirror. David remained frozen in his blind, afraid to move or make any sound that might draw the creature's attention, because he was now certain that whatever was out there was not human despite its superficial appearance. No person could move through the forest with such perfect silence, and no human would engage in such bizarre mimicry. As the evening progressed, the figure continued its strange performance. It would stand motionless for 10 or 15 minutes, then suddenly turn its head in exactly the same pattern David had used to scan for deer. It would raise its rifle, and David could see now that it did have some kind of weapon, and aim at invisible targets in the meadow. Most unsettling of all, the figure began to whisper to itself in what sounded like David's own voice. The words were too quiet to make out clearly, but the cadence and tone were unmistakably his own. It was as though the creature was practicing human speech, rehearsing the sounds and inflections it had observed. Occasionally, David could make out familiar phrases, things he had said to himself earlier that day, hunting observations and casual comments that he thought no one else had heard. As full darkness fell, the figure finally moved away from its watching position. But instead of leaving the area entirely, it began circling David's cabin, always staying just at the edge of visibility in the moonlight. David could track its progress by the faint sounds it made and the occasional glimpse of movement between the trees. The creature spent over an hour circling the cabin, apparently studying it from every angle. David watched through his rifle scope as it approached the windows, peering inside with movements that were too fluid and predatory to be human. At one point it tried the door handle, testing whether the cabin was locked. When the creature finally disappeared into the deeper forest, David waited another hour before leaving his blind. The walk back to his cabin was the longest and most terrifying of his life. Every shadow could be hiding the watching thing, every sound could signal its return. David kept his rifle ready and his headlamp sweeping constantly from side to side. Inside the cabin, David immediately checked all the windows and doors, making sure everything was securely locked. He loaded additional shells into his rifle and placed it within easy reach. But sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin settling, every gust of wind through the trees, every night sound made him wonder if the creature had returned. Around 3 a.m., David heard footsteps on his porch. The sounds were deliberate and unhurried, as though someone was casually walking back and forth across the wooden boards. But these weren't normal footsteps. They had a strange, shuffling quality, with irregular spacing that suggested the walker had difficulty maintaining a normal human gait. David crept to the front window and peered through a gap in the curtains. In the moonlight, he could see a figure standing at the far end of his porch. It was wearing his exact outfit again, down to the smallest details. But now David could see its face, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The creature had somehow obtained or created a mask that looked exactly like David's own face. Every detail was perfect. His brown eyes, his graying beard, even the small scar on his left cheek from a childhood accident. But the expression was wrong, frozen in a grotesque parody of human emotion that never changed or moved. The thing stood on his porch for nearly an hour, occasionally turning its head to look directly at the window where David was hiding. Each time their eyes met through the glass, David felt a chill of recognition and revulsion. It was like looking at himself, but drained of all humanity and warmth. Finally, the creature walked to the cabin door and began knocking. The sound was rhythmic and patient, exactly the way David himself would knock on a friend's door. Between knocks, it spoke in David's own voice. "David, it's me, I'm locked out, can you let me in?" The voice was perfect, not just the sound, but the speech patterns and inflections that David recognized as his own. If he hadn't been watching through the window, he might have believed it really was himself speaking. "I forgot my key," the voice continued. "I've been hunting all day. I'm cold and tired. Please open the door." David remained silent, his rifle aimed at the door. The knocking continued for several more minutes, then stopped. Through the window, David watched the creature walk to the edge of the porch and simply disappear into the darkness, moving with that same unnatural silence he had observed earlier. David didn't sleep at all that night. He sat in a chair facing the door, his rifle across his knees, waiting for the creature to return. But the rest of the night passed without incident, and when dawn finally came, he felt safe enough to examine his porch for evidence of the nocturnal visitor. The wooden boards showed clear footprints in the morning dew, bootprints that matched David's own perfectly. But there were too many of them, scattered in random patterns as though the creature had been pacing back and forth for hours. More disturbing, some of the prints showed an impossible stride length, as though the thing had been able to stretch its legs far beyond normal human proportions. David packed his gear and left the cabin that morning, cutting his hunting trip short by 2 days. He drove straight home to Richmond without stopping, checking his rearview mirror constantly to make sure he wasn't being followed. In the weeks that followed, David researched everything he could find about similar encounters in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He discovered scattered reports going back decades of hunters and hikers encountering something that mimicked human appearance and behavior with disturbing accuracy. The thing had different names in different accounts: the Mimic, the Watching Man, the Ridge Walker, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. David never returned to his hunting cabin. He put the property up for sale the following spring, though he never told potential buyers the real reason he was selling. The official listing mentioned the remote location and lack of modern conveniences, but made no reference to the thing that lived in the forest and studied human behavior with patient predatory intelligence. Sometimes late at night in his house in Richmond, David hears familiar sounds outside his windows, footsteps that match his own gait, a voice that sounds exactly like his own, calling his name from the darkness. He keeps his rifle loaded now, even in the city, and he never opens his door after sunset without first looking through the peephole to make sure the person standing there moves and behaves like a real human being. Because David knows that somewhere in the Blue Ridge Mountains, something is still watching, still learning, still practicing how to be him. Story 4. Jake Morrison was 19 years old and thought he knew everything about adventure when he decided to explore the abandoned moonshine operation his roommate had told him about. A sophomore at East Tennessee State University studying history, Jake had become fascinated with the region's Prohibition-era legacy and spent most of his free time hiking through the remote valleys and hollows, looking for remnants of illegal distilleries. His roommate Tyler had heard about Moonshine Hollow from his grandfather, an old mountain man who claimed his own father had worked for the notorious McKinnon clan during the 1920s. According to the stories, the McKinnons had operated one of the largest moonshine operations in eastern Tennessee from a hidden valley that could only be accessed through a narrow gap in the mountains. The operation had ended violently in 1929 when federal agents raided the hollow, leading to a shootout that left several people dead and the survivors scattered to the wind. Tyler's grandfather had drawn a rough map from memory, marking the approximate location of the hidden entrance and warning that the area was still considered dangerous by locals. But Jake saw only an opportunity for discovery and possibly some interesting photographs for his history project on Appalachian bootlegging culture. Jake set out on a crisp Saturday morning in October 2019, his backpack loaded with camping gear, his camera, and enough food for 2 days. The trail began at an old logging road about 20 miles east of Johnson City, winding through dense forest that showed little sign of human activity. According to Tyler's grandfather's map, he needed to follow the logging road for about 3 miles before looking for a creek that would lead him to the hidden entrance. The first part of the hike was pleasant and uneventful. The fall foliage was spectacular, painting the mountainsides in brilliant shades of red, orange, and gold. Jake took dozens of photographs, documenting not just the scenery, but also the occasional remnants of old logging operations, rusted cables, abandoned equipment, and the remains of temporary camps used by timber crews decades earlier. He found the creek exactly where the map indicated, a clear mountain stream that cut through a narrow ravine between two ridges. The water was shallow but fast-moving, creating a constant babbling sound that masked other noises in the forest. Jake followed the creek upstream, sometimes walking along its banks, sometimes wading through the water when the undergrowth became too thick to navigate on foot. After about an hour of following the creek, Jake came to what appeared to be a dead end. The ravine narrowed to barely 10 feet wide, with steep rock walls rising on both sides. But as he got closer, he realized that the apparent dead end was actually an optical illusion. The walls didn't quite meet. There was a gap barely wide enough for a single person, hidden by the angle of approach and partially concealed by overhanging vegetation. Jake squeezed through the narrow passage, his backpack scraping against the rock walls. On the other side, the ravine opened into a hidden valley that took his breath away. The hollow was roughly circular, about half a mile across, completely surrounded by steep ridges that would make it invisible from any direction, except directly overhead. A larger creek ran through the center of the valley, fed by several smaller streams that cascaded down the surrounding slopes. But what made Jake's pulse quicken were the obvious signs of human habitation scattered throughout the hollow. The remains of several buildings were visible among the trees, stone foundations, collapsed wooden structures, and what appeared to be the remnants of a large still operation near the main creek. Jake could see copper pipes, rusted metal tanks, and the stone ruins of furnaces that had once heated the mash for distilling illegal whiskey. Jake spent the afternoon exploring and photographing the ruins. The main distillery complex was larger and more sophisticated than he had expected, suggesting an operation that had produced moonshine on an industrial scale. He found the remains of at least 6 different still sites, multiple storage buildings, and what appeared to have been living quarters for the workers. Most intriguing were the defensive positions built into the rocky outcroppings around the hollow's perimeter. Stone walls and wooden barricades had been constructed to control access to the valley, with clear lines of sight that would allow defenders to spot approaching threats from any direction. Jake could even identify positions where machine gun nests had been dug into the hillsides, evidence of just how seriously the McKinnons had taken the threat of federal raids. As evening approached, Jake set up his camp near the ruins of what had once been the main house. The stone foundation was still intact, providing a windbreak and a relatively flat area for his tent. He built a small fire in what had been the house's fireplace, using fallen branches and dead wood from the surrounding forest. It was while gathering firewood that Jake first noticed the symbols carved into the trees around his campsite. They appeared to be warnings or territorial markers of some kind, crude but deliberate carvings that had been cut deep into the bark of oak and hickory trees. Some looked like primitive faces with exaggerated features, others resembled animal skulls or abstract geometric patterns. The carvings were old enough that the bark had grown partially over them, but not so old as to be from the original moonshine operation. Jake photographed the symbols, wondering if they might be related to local folklore or perhaps modern attempts by teenagers to create a spooky atmosphere in the abandoned hollow. But something about their placement and design suggested a more serious purpose. They formed a rough perimeter around the ruins, as though marking the boundaries of claimed territory. As darkness fell, Jake cooked a simple dinner over his campfire and settled in for what he expected to be a peaceful night under the stars. The hollow was remarkably quiet, with none of the usual forest sounds he was accustomed to hearing during his hiking trips. No owls calling, no small animals rustling through the underbrush, no insects chirping in the darkness. The silence was so complete that Jake could hear his own heartbeat and the sound of his breathing echoing off the surrounding ridges. Even his campfire seemed unnaturally quiet, burning with hardly any of the usual crackling and popping sounds. Around midnight, Jake was awakened by the sound of voices coming from somewhere across the hollow. At first he thought he might be dreaming or hearing the echoes of his own movements, amplified by the valley's acoustic properties. But as he lay in his sleeping bag, listening intently, The voices became clearer and more distinct. Multiple people were having a conversation somewhere near the old distillery ruins, speaking in low tones that carried clearly in the still night air. Jake unzipped his tent and peered out into the darkness. Across the hollow, he could see the faint glow of a fire near the main still site. Dark figures moved around the flames, silhouetted against the orange light like shadow puppets on a screen. The voices continued their discussion, but Jake was too far away to make out individual words. His first instinct was to call out and identify himself. He was, after all, just a college student exploring historical sites, not a threat to anyone who might be using the hollow for their own purposes. But something about the scene made him hesitate. The figures moved with a strange, jerky quality that didn't look quite human, and their voices had an odd cadence that suggested they might not be speaking English. Jake grabbed his camera and used its zoom lens to get a better look at the distant gathering. Through the viewfinder, he could see that there were at least 8 people around the fire, all wearing what appeared to be tattered clothing and moving in ways that seemed primitive and animalistic. They appeared to be preparing some kind of meal, working with tools and implements that looked handmade rather than manufactured. More disturbing was what appeared to be hanging from wooden frames near their fire, shapes that looked disturbingly like butchered animal carcasses, but with proportions that Jake couldn't quite identify in the flickering light. Jake decided that discretion was the better part of valor. He quietly packed his essential gear, leaving his tent and camping equipment behind, and began making his way toward the narrow entrance to the hollow. His plan was to retreat to a safe distance and return in daylight to retrieve his belongings, hopefully after whoever was using the hollow had moved on. But as Jake reached the edge of his campsite, he discovered that his escape route had been blocked. A crude barrier had been constructed across the narrow gap that served as the hollow's only entrance. Tree branches, rocks, and what appeared to be old bones had been woven together to create an obstacle that would be difficult to climb over quietly. More symbols had been carved into the trees on either side of the barrier, and Jake could smell something rotting and organic that made his stomach turn. Jake realized he was trapped in the hollow with whatever group had claimed it as their territory. His only option was to find a hiding place and wait for dawn, hoping that the strangers would leave before discovering his presence. He made his way to one of the defensive positions built into the rocky outcroppings, a stone-walled alcove that provided good cover and multiple escape routes. From this vantage point, Jake could observe the activity around the distant fire while remaining hidden in the shadows. What he saw over the next several hours challenged his understanding of what was possible in the modern world. The group around the fire appeared to be some kind of primitive clan or family unit, with adults and children all participating in activities that seemed to belong to a much earlier period of human development. They communicated primarily through gestures and guttural sounds, with only occasional words that might have been corrupted English or some regional dialect Jake didn't recognize. Most disturbing was their treatment of what Jake gradually realized were human remains. The shapes hanging from the wooden frames were not animal carcasses, but the butchered bodies of people, apparently being prepared for consumption. The clan members worked with practiced efficiency, using stone knives and primitive tools to process their grisly harvest. Jake watched in horrified fascination as children, some who couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 years old, participated in the butchering process with the casual familiarity of long practice. This wasn't the desperate cannibalism of people driven to extremes by starvation, but a cultural norm that had apparently been passed down through generations. As dawn approached, the clan began to pack up their camp and move deeper into the hollow, following a trail that led up one of the steep ridges. Jake waited until they had completely disappeared before leaving his hiding place and examining their abandoned fire site. The evidence he found confirmed his worst fears. Human bones littered the area, some showing clear knife marks from butchering. Crude tools made from sharpened stones and animal bones were scattered around the camp, along with primitive containers made from hollowed gourds and animal skins. Most chilling of all was a collection of personal items that had apparently been taken from previous victims. Driver's licenses, credit cards, jewelry, and clothing that suggested the clan had been preying on hikers and campers for an extended period. Jake photographed everything, though his hands were shaking so badly he wasn't sure the images would be usable. He then began the delicate process of removing the barrier from the hollow's entrance, working as quietly as possible to avoid attracting the attention of the clan members who might still be within hearing distance. The escape from Moonshine Hollow was the most terrifying experience of Jake's young life. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. Every shadow could be hiding a member of the cannibal clan. He didn't stop running until he reached his car at the old logging road, and he didn't stop driving until he reached the Johnson City Police Department. Jake's report to the authorities was met with skepticism and disbelief. The photographs he had taken were too dark and unclear to serve as definitive evidence, and the location he described was difficult to verify without conducting a major search operation in extremely remote terrain. A small search party did eventually visit the hollow, but they found no sign of recent human activity. Jake's camping equipment was gone, the fire sites had been carefully cleaned, and the barrier across the entrance had been removed. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred were the symbols carved into the trees, which the investigators dismissed as teenage pranks or local folklore. Jake transferred to a different university the following semester, moving back to his home state of Ohio, where the mountains held no hidden valleys and the forests contained no ancestral secrets. But he never forgot what he had witnessed in Moonshine Hollow, and he never stopped wondering how many other isolated communities might be surviving in the remote corners of Appalachia, living by rules and customs that civilized society had abandoned centuries ago. The photographs from that night remain locked in a safe deposit box in Columbus, Ohio, too disturbing to share, but too important to destroy. And sometimes when Jake reads news reports about missing hikers or unexplained disappearances in the Tennessee mountains, he wonders if the McKinnon clan's legacy in Moonshine Hollow is more than just historical curiosity. Story 5, Doctor. Lisa Hartwell had spent the better part of her career studying wildlife populations in the remote forests of western North Carolina. But nothing in her 15 years as a field biologist had prepared her for what she would discover in the depths of Pisgah National Forest during the autumn of 2021. At 31, Lisa was considered one of the leading experts on black bear behavior in the southeast, and her current research project involved tracking bear movements through GPS collars to better understand their feeding patterns and territory ranges. The research station where Lisa was working was located nearly 20 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a series of increasingly primitive Forest Service trails that required a four-wheel drive vehicle and considerable experience navigating mountain terrain. The isolation was exactly what her research required, an environment where bear behavior could be observed without human interference or influence. Lisa had been working alone at the station for 3 weeks, monitoring the movements of 12 collared bears through satellite tracking data and conducting weekly field surveys to document food sources and habitat changes. The work was methodical and peaceful, exactly the kind of detailed scientific observation that had drawn her to wildlife biology in the first place. Her routine involved checking a series of trail cameras positioned throughout a 50-square-mile study area, downloading data from automated monitoring stations, and maintaining detailed field notes about environmental conditions and wildlife activity. Most days, Lisa encountered nothing more unusual than the occasional curious bear or the remnants of territorial disputes between competing males. It was during her 3rd week at the station that Lisa first noticed the unusual bone arrangements. She was checking a trail camera positioned near a small creek about 2 miles from her base camp when she discovered what appeared to be an elaborate sculpture made entirely from animal bones. The structure stood nearly 4 feet tall and consisted of dozens of different skeletal elements: deer ribs, bear skulls, bird bones, and what looked like the complete skeleton of a large dog or coyote, all carefully arranged and bound together with twisted plant fibers. Lisa's first thought was that she had stumbled upon some kind of art installation, perhaps created by a local artist who used the remote forest as a natural gallery. But as she examined the structure more closely, several details troubled her. The bones showed signs of being deliberately cleaned and prepared, with knife marks indicating that the flesh had been carefully removed. More disturbing, many of the bones appeared to be quite fresh, suggesting the sculpture had been created recently. Lisa photographed the bone structure from multiple angles and recorded its GPS coordinates for future reference. She also collected samples of the plant fibers used to bind the bones together, hoping later analysis might provide clues about who had created the sculpture and when. Over the next few days, Lisa discovered similar bone arrangements throughout her study area. Some were small and simple, just a few bones arranged in geometric patterns on flat rocks or tree stumps. Others were elaborate constructions that must have taken hours or even days to complete. All of them showed the same careful preparation and deliberate artistic intent. The distribution of the bone sculptures formed a rough circle around Lisa's research station, with the most elaborate constructions positioned at what appeared to be strategic viewpoints overlooking the camp. Lisa began to feel uncomfortable about the implications of this pattern. Someone was clearly spending significant time in her study area, and their activities suggested an unhealthy obsession with death and decay. Lisa tried to rationalize the discoveries. Perhaps she was dealing with someone who practiced a form of earth-based spirituality that involved creating art from natural materials. Or maybe a local hunter was using the bone arrangements as some kind of territorial markers. But the sheer number of sculptures and their obvious complexity suggested something more obsessive and disturbing. It was on a Thursday morning in early November that Lisa first encountered the creator of the bone art. She was checking a monitoring station about 3 miles from her base camp when she noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth around the equipment. The prints were human but unusual. They showed someone walking barefoot despite the cold weather, and the toe impressions suggested feet that were unusually wide and had adapted to life without shoes. Lisa followed the footprints for about 100 yards before losing the trail on a rocky outcropping. But as she was turning to head back to her work, she caught a glimpse of movement in the forest ahead. Someone was watching her from behind a large oak tree, standing so still that they were almost invisible against the mottled shadows of the forest. "Hello?" Lisa called out, trying to keep her voice friendly and non-threatening. "I'm a researcher working in this area. I don't mean to intrude on your space." The figure remained motionless for several long seconds, then slowly stepped out from behind the tree. What Lisa saw made her blood run cold. The person was clearly human, but had been radically changed by years of living in the wilderness. They were completely naked despite the cold weather, their skin darkened and hardened by constant exposure to the elements. Their hair was long and matted, woven through with small bones, feathers, and what appeared to be preserved animal parts. Most disturbing was the person's collection of ornaments and tools. Necklaces made from animal teeth and small bones hung around their neck, and their arms and legs were decorated with intricate scarification that formed patterns similar to those Lisa had seen in the bone sculptures. They carried a crude spear tipped with a sharpened deer antler, and a collection bag made from what looked like a complete animal hide. The person's eyes were what truly terrified Lisa. They were intelligent and aware, showing none of the confusion or mental illness that might explain their appearance. This was someone who had made a deliberate choice to abandon human civilization and adopt a completely primitive lifestyle. "You have been walking in the bone gardens," the person said in a voice that was raspy from disuse but clearly articulate. "You have seen the sacred arrangements." Lisa realized she was dealing with someone who was not mentally ill, but had adopted an entirely different worldview. "I'm sorry if I disturbed anything. I'm just here to study the bears. I'll be leaving in a few days." The person tilted their head, studying Lisa with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen being examined. The bones call to those who understand their power. They speak of the circle that connects all living things. Death feeds life, life feeds death. All is connected in the endless cycle. "I understand," Lisa said, though she didn't understand at all. "Your artwork is very impressive. You're clearly very skilled." "Not artwork," the person corrected with a slight smile that revealed teeth that had been filed to sharp points. "Sacred totems. Each arrangement channels the spirit energy of the creatures who donated their bones. The forest speaks through their patterns, tells stories of hunting and being hunted, of the eternal dance between predator and prey." Lisa began backing slowly toward the monitoring station, trying to maintain eye contact while putting distance between herself and the bone collector. "That's fascinating. I'd love to learn more, but I really need to get back to my research." "Your research," the person said, their voice taking on a different tone. "You study the bears. You track their movements, document their behaviors. You understand the importance of predators in the natural order." Yes, that's right. Then you understand that every ecosystem needs its apex predator. Every territory needs a guardian who maintains the balance between life and death. Lisa realized with growing horror that the bone collector saw themselves as the apex predator of this particular forest ecosystem. The bone sculptures weren't just art or spiritual totems. They were territorial markers, warnings to potential intruders about who controlled this remote wilderness. "I should get going," Lisa said, continuing to back toward her vehicle. "Thank you for sharing your perspective with me." "The bones have been speaking about you," the person said, following her with that same predatory grace. "They say you have strong spirit energy. They say you would make a beautiful addition to the sacred arrangements." Lisa turned and ran. She made it to her truck just as the bone collector emerged from the forest behind her, moving with a fluid silence that suggested years of hunting experience. Lisa fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking as she tried to start the engine while the figure approached her vehicle. The bone collector placed one hand on the driver's side window and looked directly into Lisa's eyes. Up close, Lisa could see that their face was decorated with intricate scarification that matched the patterns on their body, and that several small bones had been inserted through piercings in their ears and nose. "The forest will miss you," they said in that raspy voice, "but the bones remember everything. They will call you back when the time is right." Lisa managed to start the truck and drove away without looking back, but she could feel the bone collector's eyes following her until she was out of sight. She didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town, where she immediately contacted the Forest Service and local law enforcement. The subsequent investigation found abundant evidence of the bone collector's presence throughout the study area. Dozens of bone sculptures were documented and photographed before being dismantled by authorities. DNA analysis of hair and skin samples found at the sites suggested a single individual who had been living in the wilderness for an extended period, possibly years, but the bone collector themselves was never found. Despite extensive searches involving tracking dogs and aerial surveillance, they seem to have vanished into the vast wilderness of Pisgah National Forest. The cave system where authorities believed they had been living showed signs of recent habitation, but was empty when investigators arrived. Lisa never returned to complete her bear research project. The data she had collected was turned over to other researchers, and she requested a transfer to a different study area in a much more populated region. But the bone collector's words about being called back continued to haunt her. 6 months later, Lisa received a package at her new research station with no return address. Inside was a small sculpture made from bird bones, arranged in the same intricate patterns she had seen in the forest. Attached was a note written in crude handwriting. "The bones remember. The forest is waiting." Lisa moved her research to a completely different state, but similar packages continued to arrive at regular intervals. Each contained a small bone sculpture and a brief message reminding her that the forest had not forgotten her presence. The packages were always mailed from different locations throughout the southeast, suggesting that the bone collector was mobile and had somehow acquired her forwarding addresses. The most recent package arrived just 3 weeks ago, containing the most elaborate bone sculpture Lisa had yet received. The note attached was longer than usual. "The sacred arrangements grow stronger with each season. The forest has chosen you as witness to the eternal cycle. Return when you are ready to understand the true connection between life and death." Lisa keeps the bone sculptures locked in a safe deposit box, unable to throw them away but afraid to display them where others might see. She has changed jobs twice and moved to different states, but the packages continue to find her. And sometimes late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees outside her apartment, Lisa thinks she can hear the sound of bare feet walking on pavement and the soft clicking of bone ornaments moving in rhythm with each step. She knows that somewhere in the vast wilderness of Appalachia, the bone collector continues their sacred work, creating art from death and waiting patiently for their chosen witness to return to the forest that remembers everything. Story 6. Tom Bradley had guided hiking and camping expeditions through the mountains of West Virginia for over 20 years, but his final trip to the New River Gorge in September 2020 would end his career and leave him with scars that went far deeper than the physical wounds he barely survived. At 45, Tom was considered one of the most experienced wilderness guides in the region, someone who knew the backcountry trails and hidden camping spots better than almost anyone alive. The expedition that changed everything was supposed to be routine, a 3-day wilderness survival course for a group of corporate executives who wanted to challenge themselves outside their comfortable office environments. Tom had conducted dozens of similar trips, teaching basic wilderness skills while ensuring his clients' safety in the remote areas where few people ever ventured. The group consisted of 6 participants, 4 men and 2 women, all in their 30s and 40s, all successful professionals who spent their working lives in climate-controlled buildings and wanted to reconnect with more primitive survival instincts. Tom had selected a campsite deep in the gorge, accessible only by a challenging 5-mile hike down steep trails that would give his clients the authentic wilderness experience they were paying for. The campsite was one of Tom's favorites, a flat area beside a clear mountain stream, surrounded by towering cliffs that created a natural amphitheater and provided protection from wind and weather. The location was so remote that Tom had never encountered other campers there, making it perfect for teaching wilderness skills without outside interference. The first day went exactly according to plan. Tom led his group through basic survival techniques, building shelters from natural materials, identifying edible plants, purifying water from the stream, and starting fires without matches or lighters. His clients were enthusiastic and eager to learn, throwing themselves into the challenges with the same competitive energy they brought to their professional lives. By evening, the group had successfully constructed a series of primitive shelters and prepared a meal using only resources they had gathered from the surrounding forest. Tom felt satisfied with their progress and looked forward to the more advanced skills training planned for the following day. It was around midnight when Tom first realized they were being watched. He had been awakened by a sound that didn't belong in the natural symphony of the forest, a soft clicking noise that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Tom lay still in his sleeping bag, listening intently and trying to identify the source of the unusual sounds. The clicking had a rhythmic quality, almost like a form of primitive communication. It would start from one direction, then be answered by similar sounds from other locations around their campsite. Tom realized with growing unease that whatever was making the sounds had completely surrounded their camp. Tom quietly unzipped his sleeping bag and reached for the hunting knife he always kept within easy reach during wilderness expeditions. He had encountered black bears, mountain lions, and even the occasional rabid animal during his years of guiding, but this felt different. The sounds suggested intelligence and coordination rather than the random movements of wild animals. Moving as silently as possible, Tom crawled to the edge of his shelter and peered out into the darkness. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, providing barely enough light to see the immediate area around their camp. But at the very edge of the firelight's reach, Tom could make out several pairs of eyes reflecting the dim glow. The eyes were definitely human, but they were positioned too low to belong to people standing upright. Whatever was watching them was crouched or crawling, moving with the patience and stealth of experienced hunters. Tom counted at least 6 sets of eyes, possibly more, forming a loose circle around the campsite. Tom's first instinct was to wake his clients and evacuate the area immediately, but he was also aware that any sudden movement or noise might trigger whatever was lurking in the darkness around them. His years of experience in dangerous situations told him to remain calm and assess the threat before taking action. The clicking sounds continued for nearly an hour, sometimes soft and barely audible, other times sharp and insistent. Tom began to recognize patterns in the communication, as though different individuals were reporting on the campers' positions and activities. The intelligence behind the sounds was unmistakable. This wasn't random animal behavior, but coordinated surveillance. As dawn approached, the sounds gradually faded, and the watching eyes disappeared into the forest. Tom waited until full daylight before leaving his shelter to examine the area around their camp for evidence of their nocturnal visitors. What he found confirmed his worst fears and added new layers of horror to an already terrifying situation. Footprints surrounded their campsite, dozens of bare human footprints showing people who had crept to within feet of the sleeping campers during the night. But these weren't normal human tracks. The feet that had made them were unusually wide and long, with toe impressions that suggested digits capable of gripping like fingers. More disturbing were the signs that their watchers had been examining the camper's equipment during the night. Tom's backpack had been moved several inches from where he had left it, and the zipper had been partially opened. One of his client's hiking boots was missing, taken so quietly that no one had been awakened by the theft. Tom also found evidence that their watchers had been sampling the food supplies. A bag of trail mix had been torn open and partially consumed, but not in the messy way a raccoon or bear would have eaten. The consumption was deliberate and controlled, suggesting human intelligence evaluating the unfamiliar food source. Most chilling of all were the arrangements of small stones and twigs that had been placed around the perimeter of their camp. The patterns were clearly intentional, forming what appeared to be territorial markers or perhaps ritual symbols. Tom had seen similar markings during his years in the wilderness, but never in such elaborate configurations or in such close proximity to human campers. Tom faced an impossible decision. He could tell his clients about the nocturnal visit and risk causing panic that might lead to injuries during their evacuation hike, or he could keep the information to himself and hope that whatever was stalking them would lose interest and move on. Tom chose a middle course. He announced that weather conditions were changing and they needed to break camp earlier than planned, leading the group back towards civilization without explaining the real reason for their early departure. His clients were disappointed, but accepted his explanation based on his reputation for prioritizing safety. But as they began hiking out of the gorge, Tom realized that their watchers had no intention of letting them leave peacefully. The pack was following them, moving through the forest parallel to their trail with a coordination and stealth that spoke of years of hunting experience. Tom could occasionally catch glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, but whenever he turned to look directly, he saw nothing but trees and shadows. The clicking communication continued throughout their hike, always just at the edge of hearing. Tom began to understand that the sounds were tactical communications. The pack was coordinating their movements, planning something that would happen when conditions were right. About halfway through their evacuation hike, Tom realized what the pack was waiting for. The trail they were following passed through a narrow ravine with steep walls on both sides, the perfect location for an ambush. If the pack intended to attack, that would be the ideal spot to trap their prey with no escape routes. Tom called a halt to their march and gathered his clients for what he told them was a rest break. In reality, he was trying to figure out how to avoid the trap he knew was waiting ahead. "We're going to take a different route," Tom announced, pointing to a much steeper trail that branched off from their current path. "It's more challenging, but it will give you a better wilderness experience." His clients grumbled about the change in plans, but they trusted Tom's expertise and began following him up the more difficult trail. Tom hoped that by avoiding the obvious ambush site, he could throw off the pack's planning and get his group to safety. But the pack adapted to the route change with frightening speed and intelligence. As Tom's group climbed the steep trail, the clicking sounds intensified and seemed to come from new directions. The pack was repositioning itself, adjusting its hunting strategy to account for the unexpected change in their prey's movement pattern. Tom began to hear new sounds in addition to the clicking. Soft calls that sounded almost like human voices, but with intonations that were primitive and guttural. The pack was becoming more excited, more vocal, as though the chase was reaching its climax. It was Tom's client Jennifer who first saw them clearly. "Tom," she whispered urgently, grabbing his arm and pointing to a rocky outcropping about 50 yards ahead. "There are people up there. They're not wearing any clothes." Tom looked where she was pointing and felt his blood turn to ice. 4 figures crouched on the rocks above their trail, silhouetted against the sky. They were clearly human, but moved with an animal-like fluidity that was deeply unsettling. Their hair was long and matted, their skin darkened by exposure and dirt, and they carried primitive weapons that looked like sharpened sticks and crude stone knives. "Everyone stay calm," Tom said quietly to his group. "We're going to turn around slowly and go back the way we came." But as they turned, Tom saw that their retreat was also blocked. More figures had emerged from the forest behind them, cutting off their escape route. The pack had successfully herded them into a killing ground where there was nowhere to run. Tom counted at least 8 individuals surrounding his group, possibly more hidden in the forest. They moved with the coordinated precision of experienced hunters who had performed this same deadly choreography many times before. "What do they want?" whispered Michael, one of Tom's clients, his voice shaking with fear. "Food," Tom replied grimly, realizing the horrible truth of their situation. "We're the food." The pack began closing in, moving down from the rocky outcroppings and emerging from their forest hiding places. They communicated constantly through their clicking language, clearly coordinating their attack to prevent any of their prey from escaping. Tom pulled out his hunting knife and positioned himself between the pack and his clients. "Stay together," he ordered. "Make noise, throw rocks, do whatever you can to fight back. We're not going down without a fight." The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously. The pack moved with inhuman speed and coordination, using their primitive weapons with deadly efficiency. Tom managed to wound 2 of the attackers with his knife, but there were too many of them, and they showed no fear of pain or injury. The battle lasted only minutes before Tom's group was overwhelmed. 3 of his clients were killed in the initial assault, their throats opened by stone knives before they could even scream. Jennifer managed to run about 20 yards before being brought down by 2 pack members who moved through the forest faster than any human should have been able to run. Tom himself was struck in the head by a thrown rock and knocked unconscious during the early moments of the fight. When he woke up hours later, he was alone among the bodies of his clients. The pack had taken what they wanted and disappeared back into the deep forest, leaving Tom to survive his injuries and somehow make his way back to civilization. The official investigation concluded that Tom's group had been attacked by a rabid bear, despite the obvious evidence of human involvement. The knife wounds on the victims were attributed to Tom's own weapon during his attempts to fight off the animal attack. Tom's account of coordinated human predators was dismissed as the traumatic delusions of a brain-injured survivor. Tom never guided another wilderness expedition. The physical wounds healed, but the knowledge of what was hunting in the remote areas of West Virginia made it impossible for him to return to the work he had loved. He moved to a small town where he could see his neighbors' houses and hear the sounds of civilization, but he never felt completely safe again. Sometimes late at night when the wind is blowing through the trees, Tom thinks he can still hear the clicking sounds that haunted his last expedition. And he knows that somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, the pack is still hunting, still coordinating their attacks with the patient intelligence of apex predators who have learned that humans make the most challenging and rewarding prey of all. Story 7. Angela Patterson had worked as a social worker for the Kentucky Department of Children and Family Services for 7 years, but nothing in her training had prepared her for the case that would end her career and leave her questioning everything she thought she knew about human development. At 29, Angela was considered one of the most dedicated caseworkers in her district, someone who would go to extraordinary lengths to help children in dangerous or neglected situations. The call came on a grey Monday morning in March 2022. A family of hikers had discovered what appeared to be a lost child wandering alone in the Daniel Boone National Forest, about 30 miles southeast of London, Kentucky. The child, a girl who appeared to be around 8 years old, had been found wearing dirty, torn clothing and seemed unable or unwilling to speak. Local law enforcement had taken her to the county hospital for medical evaluation before contacting social services. Angela drove to the hospital expecting a routine case of child abandonment or abuse. Unfortunately, such cases were far too common in the rural areas of eastern Kentucky, where poverty, drug addiction, and social isolation often created dangerous situations for children. Angela had handled dozens of similar cases and felt confident in her ability to help whatever traumatized child was waiting for her. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the pediatrician who had examined the girl, met Angela in the hospital corridor with a puzzled expression. "I've never seen anything quite like this," Dr. Hayes said, reviewing the child's chart. "Physically, she appears healthy, though she shows signs of having lived outdoors for an extended period. But her behavior is unusual." "Unusual how?" Angela asked, preparing herself for the typical signs of severe neglect or trauma. "She doesn't speak, but she clearly understands language. She responds to simple commands and seems to comprehend everything we say to her. But she watches people with an intensity that's unsettling. And she mimics everything, every gesture, every facial expression, every sound. It's like she's studying us, learning how to be human. Angela followed Dr. Hayes to the pediatric ward, where she got her first look at the child who would change her life forever. The girl was sitting on the edge of a hospital bed, wearing a patient gown that was several sizes too large for her small frame. Her hair was dark and tangled, and her skin showed the weathered appearance of someone who had spent significant time outdoors. But it was her eyes that immediately captured Angela's attention. They were large and dark, but held an intelligence and awareness that seemed far beyond her apparent age. The child watched Angela's approach with the focused attention of a predator, evaluating potential prey. "Hello, sweetheart," Angela said gently, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "My name is Angela. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The child tilted her head slightly, studying Angela's face with that unnervingly intense gaze. Then, without warning, she perfectly mimicked Angela's greeting, using exactly the same tone, inflection, and even facial expression. "Hello, sweetheart. My name is Angela. I'm here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The voice was Angela's own, reproduced with such accuracy that it was like hearing a recording of herself. But the child's lips didn't quite sync with the words, as though she was lip-syncing to a performance rather than actually speaking. Angela felt a chill run down her spine, but she maintained her professional composure. "That's very good. You're a quick learner. But I'd like to know your real name. What do people call you?" The child continued to stare at Angela for several long seconds, then repeated the question back in Angela's exact voice. "What do people call you?" Dr. Hayes leaned closer to Angela and whispered, "She's been doing this with everyone who's tried to talk to her. Perfect mimicry, but no original communication. It's like she's learning our language by copying it exactly." Angela spent the next hour trying different approaches to communicate with the child. She attempted simple yes or no questions, basic sign language, drawing pictures, and even playing simple games. The child watched everything with that same intense focus and mimicked Angela's actions with disturbing precision, but never displayed any independent behavior or original thought. More unsettling was the child's physical mimicry. She copied Angela's posture, her hand gestures, even the way she crossed her legs while sitting. When Angela smiled, the child smiled back, but the expression was slightly off, like a mask that didn't quite fit properly. After exhausting her usual techniques, Angela arranged for the child to be transferred to a specialized residential facility where she could receive more intensive evaluation and care. The Mountain View Children's Center was located in a rural area about an hour from the hospital, providing a quiet environment where traumatized children could begin the healing process. Angela drove the child to Mountain View herself, hoping that the car ride might provide an opportunity for breakthrough communication. But the girl remained silent throughout the journey, staring out the window with that same unnervingly focused attention. Occasionally, she would turn to watch Angela drive, mimicking her hand positions on the steering wheel and even copying her breathing patterns. The staff at Mountain View were experienced in dealing with severely traumatized children, but they were immediately struck by the unusual nature of their new resident. Sarah Mitchell, the facility's director, pulled Angela aside after the initial intake interview. "In 20 years of working with abused and neglected children, I've never encountered anything like this," Sarah said. "The child shows no emotional responses, no fear, no sadness, no happiness. She just watches and copies. It's like she's an actor studying for a role, but she doesn't understand what the role actually means." Angela visited the child regularly over the next few weeks, hoping to build trust and establish some form of communication. But instead of progress, she began to notice increasingly disturbing patterns in the child's behavior. The girl had begun mimicking other children at the facility, copying not just their words and actions, but also their emotional states. When another child cried, she would produce tears and sobbing sounds that were perfectly accurate, but completely devoid of genuine emotion. When children played together, she would join in, but her participation was always slightly off, as though she was following a script rather than engaging naturally. More troubling was the child's effect on the other residents. Several children complained that she made them feel weird or scared, though they couldn't articulate exactly why. One 7-year-old boy refused to be in the same room with her, claiming that She steals people's faces. Angela began to suspect that the child might be suffering from a rare psychological condition or developmental disorder. She arranged for consultations with specialists in child psychology, autism spectrum disorders, and trauma-related conditions. But none of the experts could provide a satisfactory diagnosis for the child's unusual behavior. It was during Angela's 4th week of visits that she witnessed something that changed her understanding of what they were dealing with. Angela arrived at Mountain View for her regular visit to find the child sitting alone in the facility's common room, apparently playing with a set of building blocks. But as Angela watched from the doorway, she realized the child wasn't playing in any normal sense. She was constructing elaborate structures that showed an understanding of engineering and spatial relationships far beyond what should have been possible for her apparent age. More disturbing was what happened when Angela entered the room. The child immediately knocked down her construction and began playing with the blocks in a much simpler, more age-appropriate manner. It was as though she had been performing advanced cognitive tasks, but switched to mimicking normal child behavior the moment she detected an adult observer. "That's very creative," Angela said, sitting down beside the child. "Did you build that all by yourself?" The child looked up at Angela and smiled, but the expression was a perfect copy of Angela's own smile reflected back at her. "Did you build that all by yourself?" she repeated in Angela's voice. Angela decided to try a different approach. Instead of asking questions, she began talking about herself, sharing simple personal information in hopes of encouraging the child to reciprocate. "I live in a small apartment in town," Angela said. "I have a cat named Whiskers. I like to read books and watch movies. Do you have any pets?" The child listened intently, then repeated Angela's words exactly. "I live in a small apartment in town. I have a cat named Whiskers. I like to read books and watch movies. Do you have any pets?" But then something unexpected happened. The child continued speaking, but now she was using the voice and speech patterns of Dr. Hayes from the hospital. "She doesn't speak, but she clearly understands language. She responds to simple commands and seems to comprehend everything we say to her." Angela felt her blood run cold as she realized what she was hearing. The child was reciting conversations she had overheard, using the exact voices of the people who had spoken. But she was combining different conversations, creating a patchwork of borrowed words and phrases that formed a strange, disjointed narrative. The child continued her recitation, switching between different voices Angela recognized: Sarah Mitchell from the facility, other staff members, even children who lived at Mountain View. It was like listening to a recording that had been randomly shuffled, with different people's voices, speaking fragments of conversations from different times and places. Angela began to understand that the child wasn't just mimicking recent interactions. She was somehow storing and replaying every conversation she had ever heard, with perfect vocal reproduction. The implications were both fascinating and terrifying. "How long have you been listening to people talk?" Angela asked gently. The child tilted her head and studied Angela's face before responding in a voice Angela didn't recognize. An older woman with a slight Appalachian accent. "Long time, child. Long, long time. Been listening since before the forgetting." "What forgetting?" Angela pressed. The child's expression changed subtly, becoming more alert and focused. When she spoke again, it was in yet another voice, this one belonging to a young boy. "Don't remember the before time. Don't remember the warm place. Only remember the watching, the learning, the becoming like them." Angela realized she was finally getting some form of original communication from the child, though it was being expressed through borrowed voices rather than the child's own speech. "Who taught you to watch and learn?" "The tall ones," the child replied in an elderly man's voice. "The ones who live in the deep places. They said, learn the small people ways. Learn to be like them. Then the small people will take you to the warm places where there is always food." Angela felt a chill of understanding. The child was describing some form of deliberate conditioning, as though she had been trained to mimic human behavior for a specific purpose. But trained by whom and why? "Where are the tall ones now?" Angela asked. The child's eyes grew distant, and when she spoke it was in a voice filled with sadness that Angela recognized as belonging to one of the facility's younger residents. "They said wait in the forest places. They said the kind woman would come and take me to the food places. They said be good small people until the time for going home. Angela realized with growing horror that the child had been deliberately placed where she would be found by hikers. She was some kind of infiltrator, trained to mimic human behavior well enough to be taken into care facilities where she could, what? Gather information? Report back to whoever had raised her? What happens when it's time to go home? Angela asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. The child looked directly into Angela's eyes and spoke in a voice that was definitely her own, though it was harsh and guttural from disuse. Then the tall ones come to the warm places. Then the tall ones take all the small people back to the deep places. Then there is much food for the winter sleeping. Angela understood. The child was bait, trained to infiltrate human communities and learn their locations, their routines, their vulnerabilities. She was a scout for something larger and more predatory, something that viewed humans as a food source to be harvested when conditions were right. Angela excused herself and immediately called law enforcement, but she struggled to explain what she had discovered without sounding delusional. How could she tell them that a seemingly normal child was actually a trained infiltrator working for cannibalistic feral humans living in the wilderness? When Angela returned to the common room, the child was gone. A frantic search of the facility revealed that she had somehow unlocked and opened a window in an unused room, squeezing through an opening that should have been too small for her body. She had disappeared into the forest that surrounded Mountain View, leaving no trace except muddy footprints that led into the dense woods. Angela never saw the child again, but over the following months, she began hearing disturbing reports from other social service agencies throughout eastern Kentucky. Children found in similar circumstances, apparently abandoned in wilderness areas, displaying unusual mimicry behaviors and inevitably escaping from care facilities after brief stays. Angela quit her job 6 months later, moving to a different state where the mountains held no hidden communities of watchers and learners. But she still wonders about the child she tried to help, and she still worries about the purpose behind that elaborate deception. Because somewhere in the remote hollows of Appalachia, Angela knows that something is teaching children to perfectly imitate human behavior while remaining fundamentally inhuman themselves. And she fears that one day, when enough scouts have been placed and enough intelligence has been gathered, the tall ones will come down from the deep places to collect their harvest of small people who never saw the trap being set around them. Story 8. Doctor. Robert Chen had spent 15 years as a geologist for the United States Geological Survey, but his mineral assessment expedition to the George Washington National Forest in Virginia during the summer of 2021 would be his last field assignment and the beginning of nightmares that still wake him in cold sweats 3 years later. At 38, Robert was considered one of the most methodical and reliable field researchers in his department, someone who could be trusted to conduct thorough surveys in remote locations with minimal supervision. The assignment seemed routine when it was first proposed. The USGS had received reports of unusual mineral formations in a previously unexplored valley deep within the national forest, about 40 miles southwest of Charlottesville. Satellite imagery showed promising geological structures that might indicate the presence of rare earth elements or other valuable mineral deposits. Robert's job was to conduct a comprehensive survey, collect rock and soil samples, and determine whether the area warranted further exploration. Robert arrived at the Forest Service Station on a Monday morning in early July, meeting with Ranger Tom Patterson to review maps and discuss access routes to the target area. The valley Robert needed to survey was accessible only by a series of old logging roads that had been abandoned for decades, requiring a four-wheel drive vehicle and considerable hiking to reach the most promising geological formations. Not many people go into that particular valley, Ranger Patterson mentioned as they reviewed the topographical maps. It's pretty isolated, and the terrain can be challenging. You'll be on your own out there, so make sure you check in with us every evening by satellite phone. Robert appreciated the solitude that came with geological fieldwork. Some of his best discoveries had been made in remote locations where he could work without distractions, methodically collecting data and samples while enjoying the peace of wilderness environments. The valley he was assigned to survey looked particularly interesting from a geological perspective. with exposed rock formations that suggested a complex history of volcanic activity and mineral deposition. The drive to the valley took most of the morning, following increasingly primitive roads that eventually required Robert to engage his vehicle's four-wheel drive system to navigate rocky creek beds and steep inclines. The last 5 miles had to be covered on foot, with Robert carrying his geological equipment, camping gear and food supplies for a planned 3-day survey. The valley itself was spectacular. Steep ridges rose on 3 sides, creating a natural bowl filled with dense forest and cut by a clear mountain stream that Robert designated as Cannibal's Creek on his field maps, though he had no idea how prophetic that name would prove to be. The geological formations were even more promising than the satellite imagery had suggested, with exposed limestone cliffs, granite outcroppings, and mineral veins that warranted detailed sampling and analysis. Robert set up his base camp near the creek, positioning his tent on a flat area that provided easy access to water while offering good views of the surrounding formations. He spent his first afternoon conducting preliminary surveys, photographing rock formations, and identifying the most promising locations for detailed sampling work. The evening was peaceful and productive. Robert prepared his dinner over a small camping stove while reviewing his initial findings and planning the next day's work. The valley was remarkably quiet, with none of the usual sounds of wildlife that typically characterized healthy forest ecosystems. Robert attributed the silence to the valley's isolation and the natural acoustics created by the surrounding ridges. It was during his second day of surveying that Robert first discovered evidence of human activity in the valley. He was collecting samples from a promising quartz vein about half a mile from his camp when he noticed what appeared to be an old trail cutting across the hillside. The path was subtle, just a slight depression in the forest floor that suggested regular foot traffic over many years. Robert's geological training had taught him to notice patterns and disturbances that others might miss, and this trail definitely showed signs of consistent use. Following the trail out of curiosity, Robert discovered that it led to a series of natural caves formed in the limestone cliffs. The caves appeared to have been enlarged and modified by human hands, with carefully stacked stone walls, creating barriers and storage areas within the natural chambers. The work was primitive, but skillfully executed, suggesting people with considerable experience in stone construction. Robert documented the caves with his camera, thinking they might represent historical Native American habitation sites that would be of interest to archaeological researchers. But as he explored deeper into the cave system, he began to find evidence that suggested much more recent occupation. The caves contained what appeared to be living spaces furnished with modern items that had been scavenged or stolen from the outside world. Sleeping areas were constructed from salvaged mattresses, foam padding, and military surplus sleeping bags. Cooking areas featured metal pots, pans, and utensils that looked like they had been taken from camping or hiking equipment. More disturbing were the personal items Robert found scattered throughout the caves. Driver's licenses, credit cards, jewelry, watches, and clothing that clearly belonged to different people. Dozens of different people, based on the variety of items and their various states of wear and weathering. Robert began to feel uneasy about his discoveries. The caves obviously represented some form of long-term human habitation, but the collection of personal items suggested something more sinister than a simple hermit's hideaway. The variety and quantity of belongings indicated that many different people had passed through this location, but there was no sign of any current residents. As Robert prepared to return to his camp and report his findings to the Forest Service, he made a discovery that changed his understanding of what he was dealing with entirely. In the deepest part of the cave system, hidden behind a carefully constructed stone wall, Robert found what could only be described as a charnel house. Human bones filled a natural chamber that had been enlarged to serve as a storage area for the remains of countless victims. The bones showed clear evidence of being deliberately cleaned and processed, with knife marks indicating that the flesh had been systematically removed. Some of the bones were quite old, weathered and yellowed with age. Others appeared much more recent, still showing traces of dried tissue and marrow. Robert estimated that the bone chamber contained the remains of at least 30 people, possibly many more, accumulated over a period of years or even decades. Robert's geological training included enough knowledge of forensic anthropology to recognize that he was looking at evidence of systematic cannibalism on a massive scale. This wasn't the desperate survival cannibalism of people driven to extremes by starvation, but an organized operation that had been processing human victims for food over an extended period. Fighting back nausea and horror, Robert photographed the bone chamber and collected GPS coordinates for the location. He then began a careful retreat from the cave system, trying to move as quietly as possible in case the inhabitants might return while he was still in the area. But as Robert emerged from the caves, he realized that his discovery had not gone unnoticed. Fresh footprints in the soft earth outside the cave entrance showed that someone had been watching him during his exploration. The prints were human, but showed feet that were unusually wide and calloused, suggesting people who regularly walked barefoot over rough terrain. Robert followed the footprints for a short distance before losing the trail on rocky ground. But the implications were clear. He was no longer alone in the valley, and whoever lived in the caves was now aware of his presence. Robert made the decision to abandon his geological survey and evacuate the valley immediately. He hiked back to his camp as quickly as possible, constantly looking over his shoulder for any sign of pursuit. The forest that had seemed so peaceful the day before now felt threatening and hostile, filled with shadows that could be hiding watchers. At his camp, Robert discovered that his equipment had been disturbed during his absence. His tent had been searched, his food supplies had been sampled, and several items were missing, including his emergency flare gun and his spare batteries for his satellite phone. More disturbing was what had been left behind. Crude symbols had been drawn in the dirt around his campsite using what appeared to be charcoal or ash. The markings looked like primitive pictographs showing human figures in various poses, some standing, some lying down, some appearing to be dismembered or butchered. Robert understood that the symbols were a message, a warning that he had been marked as the next victim for the cannibalistic community that controlled this isolated valley. The fact that his satellite phone batteries had been stolen suggested that his watchers understood modern technology well enough to prevent him from calling for help. Robert packed only his most essential gear and began hiking toward his vehicle as quickly as the terrain would allow. But as darkness fell, he realized that he was being followed. Soft sounds in the forest behind him indicated that multiple people were tracking his movement, staying just out of sight, but close enough to prevent any chance of escape. The pursuit continued throughout the night. Robert pushed himself to maintain a punishing pace, using his headlamp sparingly to avoid giving away his exact position while trying to navigate the treacherous mountain terrain in near total darkness. Behind him, his pursuers communicated through soft calls and whistles that echoed through the forest, like the sounds of hunting predators. Several times during the night, Robert thought he had lost his pursuers, only to hear their signals resuming from new directions. They were coordinating their hunt with the skill of experienced trackers, probably using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to anticipate his movements and cut off potential escape routes. It was just before dawn when Robert finally reached his vehicle. He had never been so relieved to see anything in his life as that familiar SUV parked at the end of the abandoned logging road. But his relief turned to despair when he discovered that his pursuers had sabotaged the vehicle during his absence. All 4 tires had been slashed, the engine compartment had been vandalized, and the radio antenna had been cut. Most seriously, the fuel tank had been punctured, leaving a dark stain of gasoline on the ground that made the vehicle completely inoperable. Robert realized that the cannibalistic community had planned for his attempted escape, probably using the time while he was hiking out to prepare this trap. They had effectively stranded him in their hunting territory, far from any possibility of outside assistance. With no other options, Robert began the long hike toward the nearest Forest Service road, hoping to reach civilization before his pursuers caught up with him. The 40-mile journey would take him at least 2 days on foot, assuming he could maintain his pace and avoid getting lost in the vast wilderness. But Robert's knowledge of geology and terrain navigation served him well during his desperate flight through the mountains. He was able to follow creek beds and ridgelines that led generally toward populated areas, staying ahead of his pursuers through careful route selection and sheer determination. On the second day of his escape, Robert finally encountered a group of legitimate hikers who were able to share water and food while he used their satellite communication device to contact emergency services. A helicopter rescue team extracted Robert from the wilderness that same afternoon, ending his ordeal, but beginning a new nightmare of disbelief and bureaucratic indifference. Robert's report to law enforcement was met with skepticism and demands for proof that his investigators were unwilling to risk their lives to obtain. The bone chamber he had photographed was dismissed as a Native American burial site that had been disturbed by natural processes. The sabotaged vehicle was attributed to vandalism by local teenagers, and Robert's account of being hunted by cannibals was classified as a stress-induced delusion brought on by the trauma of being lost in the wilderness. No official investigation was ever conducted, and the valley remains closed to the public under the generic designation of sensitive ecological area. Robert's geological survey was never completed, and the mineral formations he had been sent to evaluate remain unexplored and undocumented. Robert transferred to a desk job with the USGS, refusing all further field assignments that would require him to work alone in remote areas. But he continues to monitor missing person reports from the Virginia mountain regions, noting the disturbing frequency with which hikers, campers, and hunters disappear without a trace in areas adjacent to the valley he barely escaped. Because Robert knows that somewhere in the hidden recesses of the George Washington National Forest, a cannibalistic community continues to hunt and feed on anyone unfortunate enough to wander into their territory. And he knows that the bones of their victims continue to accumulate in that limestone charnel house, awaiting discovery by investigators brave enough to face the truth about what lives in the deepest, darkest corners of the Appalachian wilderness. Story 9. Michelle Rodriguez had been trail running in the Great Smoky Mountains for over 10 years, but her morning run on the abandoned Howling Trail in October 2020 would be her last solo expedition into the Tennessee wilderness. At 33, Michelle was an experienced ultramarathon runner who specialized in mountain trail racing and often trained on the most challenging and remote paths she could find in the national park. The Howling Trail had been officially closed to the public for nearly 15 years due to safety concerns and environmental protection issues, but Michelle had discovered that dedicated trail runners could still access the path through an unmarked entrance near the Cataract Falls parking area. The trail offered 12 miles of challenging terrain, with significant elevation changes and spectacular views that made it worth the risk of running on an unmaintained path. Michelle arrived at the trailhead before dawn on a crisp Saturday morning in mid-October, planning to complete the full trail loop before the weekend crowds filled the more popular hiking areas. She preferred early morning runs when the forest was quiet and she could enjoy the meditative rhythm of her breathing and footsteps without the distractions of other hikers or trail traffic. The first 5 miles of the Howling Trail wound through dense hardwood forest that was spectacular in its autumn colors. Michelle maintained her usual steady pace, enjoying the challenge of navigating root-covered paths and steep switchbacks while breathing the cool mountain air. The trail was overgrown in places due to lack of maintenance, but it remained clearly defined and relatively easy to follow. Michelle had named the trail Howling years earlier because of the strange acoustic effects created by the wind moving through the narrow valleys and rocky outcroppings along the route. The terrain formed natural wind tunnels that could amplify and distort sounds in ways that often produced eerie howling noises, even on relatively calm days. But as Michelle reached the halfway point of her run, she began to notice that the sounds she was hearing didn't match the wind patterns she could observe in the trees around her. The howling was coming from multiple directions and had a rhythmic quality that suggested intentional vocalizations rather than natural wind effects. The sounds would start from one location, then be answered by similar calls from other points along the trail, creating a pattern of communication that reminded Michelle of wolves or coyotes marking territory. Michelle slowed her pace and stopped to listen more carefully. The howling continued for several minutes, with different voices joining and leaving the chorus in a coordinated sequence that definitely indicated intelligent communication rather than random animal sounds. But Michelle knew that there were no wolf populations in the Great Smoky Mountains, and coyotes rarely vocalized during daylight hours. As an experienced trail runner, Michelle had encountered various wildlife during her mountain expeditions. She had seen black bears, wild boar, and numerous smaller animals, but she had never heard vocalizations quite like what she was experiencing on the Howling Trail. The sounds were definitely made by something with vocal cords capable of producing complex tones, but they had a quality that seemed almost human in their emotional expression. Michelle decided to continue her run, but remained alert for any signs of the creatures making the mysterious sounds. The trail ahead climbed steeply through a series of switchbacks that would take her to the highest elevation point of the loop before beginning the descent back toward the parking area. It was during this climb that Michelle first saw the source of the howling. Movement in the forest below caught her attention, and she stopped to observe what appeared to be a person moving through the trees parallel to the trail. But the figure's movements were wrong, too fluid, too low to the ground, more like an animal than a human being. Michelle used her running watch's basic zoom function to get a better look, and what she saw made her question her own perception. The figure appeared to be human, but was moving on all fours with a grace and speed that seemed impossible for normal human anatomy. It was completely naked, with long hair that appeared to be matted with mud or debris. Most disturbing was the way it moved its head, turning frequently to look directly at Michelle's position on the trail above. Michelle realized she was being stalked. The howling sounds resumed, but now Michelle could see that they were coming from the figure below her. The creature raised its head and produced a long, mournful call that was answered immediately by similar sounds from other locations in the forest. Michelle counted at least 4 different voices participating in the vocal exchange, suggesting that she was surrounded by multiple individuals. Michelle began running again, but she abandoned her usual steady pace in favor of speed. Her training instincts told her to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever was tracking her movement through the forest. The trail ahead was familiar, and she knew that the next 3 miles would take her through some of the most remote and difficult terrain on the entire loop. But as Michelle increased her pace, she discovered that her pursuers were easily keeping up with her. The howling continued from multiple directions, always seeming to stay just out of sight, but close enough to track her progress along the trail. Occasionally, she would catch glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, dark shapes moving through the trees with an unnatural silence and coordination. The vocalizations began to change as Michelle's run continued. What had started as distant howling gradually evolved into sounds that were more recognizably human, wordless calls that seemed to convey emotion and intent. The creatures were communicating about her, sharing information about her location and movement patterns with the efficiency of experienced hunters. Michelle's ultra-marathon training had taught her to run through exhaustion and discomfort, but the psychological pressure of being hunted was unlike anything she had experienced. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified and threatening. Every shadow could be hiding one of her pursuers. Every turn in the trail could be leading her into an ambush. After 2 hours of being followed, Michelle began to hear something that terrified her more than the howling had. One of the creatures was calling her name. "Michelle," came a voice from the forest to her left. The pronunciation was slightly off, as though the speaker was unfamiliar with human language, but her name was clearly recognizable. Michelle had never told anyone her name during her runs, and she wasn't wearing any identification that would reveal her identity. The creature calling her name had somehow learned it through observation or from some other source that implied a level of intelligence and planning that made her situation even more dangerous. "Michelle," called another voice from a different direction. "Stop running, Michelle, we want to talk to you." The voices were definitely human in origin, but they had an odd quality that suggested people who rarely spoke or who had developed their own dialect through isolation. Michelle realized that she was being hunted by feral humans who had been living in the wilderness long enough to develop their own communication methods, but who still retained enough contact with civilization to have learned her name. Michelle's knowledge of the trail became her greatest advantage during the pursuit. She knew every turn, every obstacle, every shortcut that could help her evade her pursuers. But she also knew that the most dangerous part of the trail lay ahead, a section that passed through dense forest with multiple branching paths that could easily lead to confusion or dead ends. The calling of her name continued throughout her desperate run, sometimes from close range, sometimes from distances that suggested her pursuers were spreading out to cover multiple possible escape routes. The coordination of their hunt was sophisticated, indicating people with extensive experience tracking prey through difficult terrain. "Michelle, you can't run forever," called a voice that sounded younger than the others, possibly belonging to a teenager or young adult. "We just want to be friends. We don't get many visitors." The attempt at friendly communication was more terrifying than the howling had been. Michelle realized that her pursuers were intelligent enough to understand that direct threats might not be the most effective hunting strategy. They were trying to lure her into stopping, into believing that she could negotiate or reason with them. As Michelle approached the final section of the trail, she could see her vehicle in the parking area below, but she also realized that her pursuers had anticipated her destination and were positioning themselves between her and her escape route. Dark shapes moved through the trees near the parking area, cutting off her direct path to safety. Michelle made a desperate decision to leave the trail entirely and attempt to reach her car through the dense forest. The terrain was much more difficult, requiring her to climb over fallen logs, push through thick undergrowth, and navigate steep slopes that were never intended for human passage. But the off-trail route also allowed Michelle to use her trail-running agility to advantage. She could move through spaces and over obstacles that would be difficult for her pursuers to follow, especially if they were hunting as a coordinated group that needed to maintain communication and visual contact. The strategy worked. Michelle managed to reach the parking area ahead of her pursuers, though she could hear them crashing through the forest behind her as they abandoned stealth in favor of speed. She reached her car just as the first of the feral humans emerged from the tree line. Michelle got her clearest look at her pursuers as she started her car and prepared to escape. They were definitely human, but had been dramatically changed by years of wilderness living. Their hair was long and unkempt, their skin darkened by exposure and marked with scars and primitive tattoos. They moved with an animal-like coordination, but retained enough human intelligence to use tools and coordinate their hunting strategies. Most disturbing was their reaction to her escape. Instead of showing frustration or anger, they seemed almost amused by the chase. They stood at the edge of the parking area, calling her name and making gestures that suggested they viewed the entire pursuit as a form of entertainment rather than a serious hunting attempt. Michelle drove away from the trailhead as quickly as the mountain roads would allow, but she couldn't shake the feeling that her escape had been permitted rather than earned. The feral humans had demonstrated enough coordination and intelligence to have trapped her if they had truly wanted to prevent her escape. Michelle never returned to the Great Smoky Mountains for trail running. She moved her training to more populated areas, where other runners and hikers provided safety in numbers, but she continues to monitor missing person reports from the national park, noting the disturbing frequency with which solo hikers and runners disappear on remote trails. Because Michelle knows that somewhere in the vast wilderness of the Smoky Mountains, a community of feral humans continues to hunt for entertainment and companionship. They call the names of their prey, not always to catch them, but sometimes simply to enjoy the fear and desperation of the chase itself. And Michelle knows that her name is still being called in the forest, echoing through the wind tunnels and rocky outcroppings of the howling trail, waiting for the day when she might be foolish enough to return and finish the game that she barely survived the first time. Story 10. Chris Baldwin had been documenting forgotten communities throughout Appalachia for his independent film company for 7 years, but his investigation into the abandoned settlement of Millerville in North Carolina's Nantahala National Forest would provide him with footage too disturbing to ever broadcast, and memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At 40, Chris specialized in creating documentaries about ghost towns and abandoned communities, exploring the stories of places that had been forgotten by time and progress. His research had led him to Millerville, a former logging community that had been established in the 1920s and abandoned during the Great Depression, when the timber company went bankrupt. According to county records, the settlement had housed nearly 200 residents at its peak, including entire families who had worked in the lumber industry. But when the economic collapse made logging unprofitable, the residents had simply vanished, leaving behind empty houses and unanswered questions about where they had gone. Chris arrived at the Forest Service station near Bryson City on a humid Monday morning in August 2019, planning to spend a week documenting the ruins of Millerville and interviewing any local residents who might remember stories about the abandoned community. Ranger Susan Martinez provided him with maps and background information, though she seemed reluctant to discuss the area in detail. "Not many people go up to Millerville anymore," Ranger Martinez said as she reviewed Chris's filming permits. "The road is barely passable, and there's not much left to see. Most of the buildings collapsed years ago." "That's exactly what makes it interesting," Chris replied, checking his camera equipment. "I want to document these places before they disappear completely. Sometimes the ruins tell better stories than the inhabited towns." The drive to Millerville required nearly 3 hours of navigating increasingly primitive mountain roads. The final 5 miles had to be covered on foot, with Chris carrying his camera gear, camping equipment, and supplies for a planned 4-day documentation project. The trail followed an old logging road that had been reclaimed by forest growth, making navigation challenging despite the GPS coordinates from county records. Millerville itself was more extensive than Chris had expected. The abandoned community covered several acres of mountain valley, with the foundations and partial structures of dozens of buildings scattered throughout the forest. Most of the original wooden structures had collapsed or been reclaimed by vegetation, but enough remained standing to give Chris a clear picture of what had once been a thriving mountain community. Chris set up his base camp in what had been the town square, positioning his tent near the ruins of what appeared to have been a general store or community building. The location provided good access to the various building sites while offering a central point for organizing his documentation work. The first 2 days of filming went smoothly. Chris systematically documented each building foundation, photographed architectural details that remained intact, and recorded extensive notes about the layout and organization of the settlement. The abandoned community told a fascinating story of adaptation to mountain life, with buildings designed to withstand harsh weather and steep terrain. But on his 3rd day in Millerville, Chris began to notice evidence that the community might not be as abandoned as official records suggested. While filming the ruins of what had been a large family home, Chris discovered signs of recent habitation scattered among the collapsed timbers. Fresh animal bones showed evidence of being deliberately cleaned and prepared for consumption. Crude tools made from salvaged metal and stone were hidden among the debris, along with containers for storing water and preserved food. More disturbing was the discovery of modern items that clearly didn't belong to the original 1930s settlement. Pieces of contemporary clothing, plastic containers, and what appeared to be pages torn from recent magazines were scattered throughout the ruins, suggesting that someone had been living in the abandoned community within the past few years. Chris began to suspect that he had stumbled upon a modern homeless encampment, or perhaps a survivalist group that had chosen to live off the grid in the ruins of the old logging community. But the evidence suggested something more complex and organized than typical transient habitation. The modern items were distributed throughout multiple building sites, indicating that several people were using different areas of the settlement for various purposes. More significantly, the items showed a level of organization and permanence that suggested long-term residence rather than temporary camping. Chris decided to expand his documentation to include evidence of modern habitation, thinking it might add an interesting contemporary angle to his historical documentary. But as he began photographing the recent additions to the abandoned settlement, he started to feel like he was being watched. The feeling began as a vague uneasiness that gradually intensified throughout the afternoon. Chris found himself looking over his shoulder frequently and scanning the tree line around the settlement for any sign of movement. Several times, he thought he caught glimpses of figures moving between the ruins, but whenever he turned to look directly, he saw nothing but shadows and vegetation. By evening, Chris was certain that he was no longer alone in Millerville. Sounds from the forest around the settlement suggested people moving through the trees with deliberate stealth, staying just out of sight but close enough to observe his activities. The sounds had a coordinated quality that indicated multiple individuals working together to maintain surveillance. Chris considered abandoning his documentation project and hiking out immediately, but darkness was falling and the mountain trail would be dangerous to navigate without daylight. He decided to spend one more night in the settlement and leave at first light, hoping that whoever was watching him would respect his obvious intention to depart peacefully. It was around midnight when Chris heard voices coming from somewhere within the ruins of Millerville. At first, the sounds were too distant and muffled to understand clearly, but as Chris listened from his tent, he began to recognize that multiple people were having conversations throughout the abandoned settlement. The voices had an odd quality, definitely human, but with speech patterns and intonations that suggested people who rarely spoke or who had developed their own dialect through isolation. Chris grabbed his camera and night vision equipment, thinking he might be able to document whatever group was using the ruins for shelter. But as he began moving through the settlement toward the sounds, he realized that what he was witnessing was much more complex than a simple homeless encampment. The abandoned community was alive with activity. Dozens of people moved through the ruins, with the familiarity of long-term residents, using the collapsed buildings for shelter and the open areas for what appeared to be some kind of community gathering. They carried primitive torches and oil lamps that provided enough light for Chris to observe their activities from a distance. What Chris saw challenged his understanding of what was possible in modern America. The people living in Millerville appeared to be an extended family or clan that had been isolated from mainstream society for so long that they had developed their own culture and lifestyle. Their clothing was a mixture of handmade garments and salvaged items that had been modified for practical use. Their tools and equipment were primitive, but skillfully crafted, suggesting people with considerable experience in wilderness survival. Most disturbing was their obvious organization and hierarchy. The group was clearly led by older individuals who directed the activities of younger members, and their interactions suggested complex social relationships that had developed over many years of communal living. Chris realized that he was looking at the descendants of the original Millerville residents, families who had never actually left the settlement when the logging industry collapsed, but had instead retreated deeper into the wilderness and adapted to a completely self-sufficient lifestyle. Using his night vision camera, Chris began documenting what appeared to be some kind of family reunion or seasonal gathering. The clan members were sharing food, telling stories around their fires, and engaging in what looked like traditional crafts and skills passed down through generations. But as Chris continued filming, he began to notice activities that were more sinister than a simple family gathering. Some of the clan members were sorting through collections of modern items that clearly didn't belong to their primitive lifestyle. Hiking gear, camping equipment, electronic devices, and personal belongings that appeared to have been taken from visitors to the forest. The items were being evaluated, repaired, and distributed among the clan members according to some system of value and utility. More disturbing were the discussions Chris could overhear about surface people and the best methods for harvesting useful items from travelers who passed through their territory. The clan had clearly been supplementing their primitive lifestyle by systematically robbing hikers, campers, and other visitors to the national forest. Chris realized that he had stumbled upon a criminal enterprise disguised as a survivalist community. The clan was using their isolation and apparent primitiveness to prey upon people who ventured into the remote areas of the forest, taking what they needed while avoiding detection by law enforcement. As Chris continued documenting the clan's activities, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Several clan members were discussing what to do about the film man who had been disturbing the old places with his picture box. They had been watching Chris for days, evaluating whether he represented a threat to their security or an opportunity for acquiring valuable equipment. Chris realized that his presence had been detected from the beginning, and the clan was now deciding his fate. Some members seemed to favor simply taking his equipment and sending him away with a warning. Others argued for more permanent solutions that would prevent him from reporting their activities to outside authorities. Chris began quietly packing his essential gear, preparing to attempt an immediate escape from the settlement. But as he moved through the ruins toward where he had left his larger equipment, he discovered that his escape route had been blocked. Clan members had positioned themselves at strategic points around the settlement, effectively trapping Chris within the ruins of Millerville. They moved with the silent efficiency of experienced hunters, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to control his movement and prevent any possibility of flight. Chris found himself surrounded by a community that had been hiding in plain sight for generations, living off the land and supplementing their primitive lifestyle through systematic predation on anyone unfortunate enough to enter their territory. They had maintained their secrets through isolation, intimidation, and, when necessary, violence against those who threatened their way of life. The clan leader, an elderly man with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades living outdoors, approached Chris with a mixture of curiosity and menace. "You've been making pictures of our home," the old man said, in a voice that showed the effects of limited education and social isolation, making pictures of family things that aren't meant for outside eyes. I'm just documenting historical sites, Chris replied, trying to keep his voice steady. I didn't know anyone still lived here. I'll delete everything and leave immediately. Pictures tell stories, the old man continued. Stories bring outside people to family places. Outside people bring government people. Government people bring ending to the old ways. Chris realized that negotiation was his only hope for survival. I understand your concerns. I can edit my documentary to remove any evidence of current habitation. I'm interested in history, not exposing people who want to live privately. The clan leader studied Chris for several long minutes, clearly weighing the risks and benefits of allowing him to leave alive. Other clan members gathered around, their faces showing the kind of hard pragmatism that comes from generations of making difficult survival decisions. "I'll give us the picture boxes," the old man finally said. "You give us the bright clothes and the metal tools. You walk away and never speak of family business to outside people. You do this and you live to see morning sun." Chris agreed immediately, turning over his camera equipment, camping gear, and anything else the clan considered valuable. The negotiation was conducted with the formality of a business transaction, suggesting that the clan had made similar arrangements with other visitors who had stumbled upon their hidden community. As dawn broke over the ruins of Millerville, Chris was escorted to the edge of the settlement and released with nothing but the clothes he was wearing and a clear understanding that his life depended on maintaining absolute silence about what he had witnessed. Chris hiked out of the forest and drove straight to the nearest airport, leaving North Carolina without reporting his experience to any authorities. The documentary project was abandoned, and Chris moved his filmmaking activities to areas where the only ghosts were safely dead and buried. But Chris knows that somewhere in the remote mountains of North Carolina, the descendants of a forgotten logging community continue to live according to their own rules, supplementing their primitive lifestyle through predation on the modern world that has forgotten they exist. And he knows that other documentarians and researchers who venture too deep into the abandoned places of Appalachia might not be fortunate enough to negotiate their way out of encounters with families who have spent generations perfecting the art of remaining hidden from the outside world. Story 11. Dr. Emily Watson had dedicated her career to studying isolated human communities, but her fieldwork expedition to the remote mountains of West Virginia in September 2021 would challenge everything she believed about civilization, humanity, and the thin line that separates the two. At 26, Emily was one of the youngest anthropologists ever to receive a Fulbright fellowship, and her research focused on how communities adapt to extreme isolation over multiple generations. Her research proposal had outlined a 6-month study of rumored settlements in the Monongahela National Forest, communities that supposedly had maintained complete isolation from mainstream society for decades. Emily's academic advisor had been skeptical about the existence of such groups in modern America, but historical records and scattered reports from Forest Service personnel suggested that some families had retreated so far into the wilderness during the Great Depression that they had essentially vanished from official records. Emily's preliminary research had identified a region of the National Forest where satellite imagery showed evidence of human structures and cleared land that didn't correspond to any official settlements or recreational facilities. The area was accessible only by a series of abandoned logging roads that hadn't been maintained since the 1970s, making it perfect for a community that wanted to remain hidden from outside contact. Emily arrived at the Forest Service station near Elkins on a cool morning in early September, carrying research equipment, camping gear, and supplies for an initial month-long expedition. Ranger Bill Thompson reviewed her permits and research proposal with obvious skepticism, warning her about the dangers of conducting solo fieldwork in such remote terrain. "I've heard stories about people living back in those mountains," Ranger Thompson said, marking Emily's planned route on a topographical map. "But in 30 years of working these forests, I've never seen any concrete evidence. You be careful out there and make sure you check in with us every few days by satellite phone." The hike to Emily's target area required 2 full days of travel through increasingly primitive terrain. The abandoned logging roads quickly deteriorated into game trails and deer paths, forcing Emily to navigate by compass and GPS through dense forest that showed little sign of human passage. But as she penetrated deeper into the mountains, she began to notice subtle signs that suggested human presence in the area. Old blazes on trees marked what appeared to be a trail system, though the markings were so weathered and overgrown that they would be invisible to casual hikers. Occasional clearings showed evidence of selective logging or land management that was too systematic to be natural, but too old to be recent commercial activity. On her second night in the mountains, Emily made camp near a clear stream in a small valley that provided good shelter and access to water. As she prepared her dinner over a small camping stove, she noticed smoke rising from somewhere deeper in the valley, indicating that she was not alone in this remote wilderness. Emily's anthropological training had taught her to approach unknown communities with patience and respect, avoiding any actions that might be perceived as threatening or intrusive. She decided to spend several days in the area, making her presence known gradually, while observing from a distance to understand the social dynamics of whoever was living in this isolated location. The next morning, Emily discovered that her camp had been visited during the night. Small items had been moved or examined, and fresh footprints in the soft earth around her tent showed that someone had approached close enough to touch her equipment. But nothing had been stolen or damaged, suggesting curiosity rather than hostile intent. Emily began leaving small gifts near her campsite, packages of food, basic medical supplies, and simple tools that might be useful to people living a subsistence lifestyle. The gifts disappeared each night and were sometimes replaced with handmade items, woven baskets, carved wooden utensils, and primitive tools that showed considerable skill in their construction. This pattern of cautious exchange continued for nearly a week before Emily finally encountered one of the people she had been studying. She was collecting water from the stream when she noticed a young woman watching her from the forest on the opposite bank. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with long hair that had been braided with natural materials and clothing that was clearly handmade from animal skins and plant fibers. But what struck Emily most was the woman's expression. She looked terrified, not of Emily herself, but of being seen by someone from the outside world. "Hello," Emily called softly, using the least threatening tone she could manage. "My name is Emily. I'm a researcher studying how people live in remote areas. I'm not here to cause any trouble." The woman remained frozen for several long seconds, then slowly approached the edge of the stream. When she spoke, her voice was clear and articulate, but with an accent and speech pattern that suggested limited contact with mainstream society. "You're from the outside places," the woman said, her voice filled with a mixture of fascination and fear. "From the places where the poison air burns the sky and the loud machines kill the silence." Emily realized she was speaking with someone who had grown up in complete isolation from modern civilization, but who had retained enough cultural memory to understand that a larger world existed beyond their mountain community. "Yes, I'm from the outside," Emily replied, "but I'm here to learn about your way of life, not to change it or expose it to others. I study how different communities survive and maintain their traditions." The woman seemed to consider this carefully before speaking again. "I am Rebecca. I'm the last one who remembers the outside words. The others have forgotten the speaking of civilization people. They have become different." Emily felt her pulse quicken with excitement. She was speaking with someone who could serve as a bridge between the isolated community and the outside world. Someone who might be able to help her understand how extreme isolation affected human social development over multiple generations. "How long have you been living here?" Emily asked. "All my life," Rebecca replied. "My grandmother came here when she was young, escaping from the hungry times when the earth was poisoned and the sky was dark. She taught me the outside words so someone would remember, but the others say the old language is dangerous. They say it brings bad thoughts and outside sickness." Emily realized she was speaking with a third-generation member of a community that had isolated itself during the Great Depression and maintained that isolation for nearly a century. The hungry times and poisoned earth were probably references to the economic collapse and environmental degradation that had driven Rebecca's grandmother to seek refuge in the mountains. "Would it be possible for me to meet the others in your community?" Emily asked. "I promise I'm not here to judge or interfere. I just want to understand how you've managed to survive on your own for so long." Rebecca's expression grew troubled. "The others are not like me anymore. They have forgotten the civilized ways. They speak only in the Old Forest tongue and follow the Old Forest laws. They think outside people are demons who bring sickness and death." Emily began to understand that she was dealing with a community that had not simply isolated itself from modern society, but had actively rejected civilization in favor of a more primitive lifestyle. Rebecca seemed to be the only member who maintained any connection to the outside world or interest in civilized behavior. "They will not hurt you if I speak for you," Rebecca continued. "But they will not understand your purpose. They believe that learning outside ways makes people weak and corrupt. They think I am already halfway to becoming a demon because I remember the civilization words." Despite the obvious risks, Emily felt compelled to study this remarkable community. Here was a group that had completely abandoned modern civilization and developed their own culture, based on primitive survival skills and rejection of outside influence. The anthropological implications were extraordinary. Rebecca agreed to escort Emily to the main settlement, but only after extracting promises that Emily would respect the community's desire for privacy and would not attempt to document their activities with cameras or recording equipment. The settlement was located in a hidden valley about 5 miles from Emily's camp, accessible only through a narrow gap between 2 ridges that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The community consisted of about 30 people living in structures built from natural materials and arranged according to principles that owed nothing to modern architecture or urban planning. Emily was struck by how completely the community had rejected civilized technology and social organization. They lived in primitive shelters, used only handmade tools, and organized their social relationships according to patterns that seemed to be based on kinship ties and traditional gender roles, rather than any modern concepts of equality or individual rights. But what disturbed Emily most was the community's reaction to her presence. The other residents treated her with a mixture of fear and hostility that suggested they viewed outside contact as a form of contamination. They communicated primarily through a mixture of English and what appeared to be a constructed language based on natural sounds and primitive vocalizations. Rebecca served as Emily's translator and protector, explaining her research purposes to the community elders and vouching for her peaceful intentions. But Emily could see that Rebecca's willingness to interact with an outsider was viewed with suspicion and disapproval by the other community members. Over the course of several days, Emily observed a society that had deliberately regressed to a pre-industrial lifestyle. The community practiced subsistence farming, hunting and gathering. They had no written language, no formal education system, and no interest in maintaining records or preserving knowledge beyond what was necessary for immediate survival. Most disturbing was their treatment of Rebecca. Despite her obvious intelligence and linguistic abilities, she was viewed as potentially dangerous because of her knowledge of outside ways. Other community members avoided extended contact with her and seemed to believe that her civilized knowledge made her susceptible to corruption by outside influences. Emily began to understand that Rebecca was trapped between 2 worlds, too educated and sophisticated to fully accept the primitive lifestyle of her community, but too isolated and dependent on them to survive on her own in the outside world. "I have been thinking about leaving," Rebecca confided to Emily during one of their private conversations. "I dream about the outside places, about schools and books and people who speak in many words about many ideas. But I don't know how to live in the outside world, and I'm afraid the others are right about civilization being poisonous." Emily faced an ethical dilemma that challenged everything she had learned about anthropological research. Her professional training emphasized observation without interference, respecting communities' desires for privacy and autonomy. But she was also witnessing what appeared to be the gradual psychological destruction of an intelligent young woman who was being punished for her intellectual curiosity and desire for broader human contact. "If you wanted to leave, I could help you," Emily offered. "There are programs to help people transition to mainstream society. You could get an education, learn job skills, build a life in the outside world. Rebecca seemed torn between desire and fear. But what if the others are right? What if outside learning makes people forget how to be truly human? What if civilization really is a sickness that destroys people's souls? Emily spent her final week with the community documenting their lifestyle and social organization, while wrestling with the question of whether she should encourage Rebecca to abandon the only life she had ever known. The community's rejection of civilization was complete and apparently irreversible. They had created a sustainable lifestyle that met their physical needs while providing psychological security through certainty and tradition. But Emily could also see that their rejection of outside knowledge was slowly destroying their ability to adapt to changing conditions or solve problems that required innovation and flexibility. Rebecca represented their last connection to the broader human community, and her potential departure would complete their isolation from the civilized world. In the end, Emily made a decision that violated her professional training but satisfied her personal conscience. On her final night with the community, she provided Rebecca with maps, supplies, and detailed instructions for reaching the outside world safely. "The choice is yours," Emily told her. "You can stay here and accept the life your community offers, or you can come with me and see what other possibilities exist. But you need to understand that either choice will involve sacrifice and uncertainty." Rebecca chose to leave. Emily and Rebecca hiked out of the mountains together, leaving behind a community that had spent 90 years rejecting civilization in favor of primitive certainty. Rebecca's departure represented the final severing of ties between the isolated group and the outside world, ensuring that their experiment in voluntary primitivism would continue without any remaining connection to civilized knowledge or values. Emily helped Rebecca enroll in community college and find housing in a small town where she could adjust gradually to life in modern society. Rebecca proved to be remarkably adaptable, quickly mastering reading, writing, and basic technology, while maintaining her appreciation for the natural world and simple living. But Emily knows that somewhere in the remote mountains of West Virginia, a community continues to live according to principles that reject everything civilization has achieved. They have chosen ignorance over knowledge, isolation over communication, and primitive survival over human progress. And with Rebecca's departure, they have lost their last link to the broader human community that could help them remember what they have chosen to abandon. Emily's research was never published. The ethical implications of her intervention and the community's desire for privacy made it impossible to share her findings with the academic world. But she continues to work with Rebecca, documenting her unique perspective on the transition from primitive isolation to civilized life, and wondering whether humanity's greatest achievements are truly worth the complex costs that civilization demands from those who choose to embrace its possibilities.